The Ilkley Moor Encounter. Chapter 1. A misty morning. The mist clung to Ilkley Moor like a ghostly shroud, transforming the familiar landscape into an ethereal dreamscape. Philip Spencer zipped up his jacket against the early December chill, his breath forming small clouds in the air as he set out on his morning walk. 56, the retired policeman still cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes that had seen their fair share of the world's oddities during his years on the force. As Philip's boots crunched on the frost-covered path, couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about the moor today. The ancient rocks loomed larger than usual in the fog, their weathered faces seeming to watch his progress with silent interest. He'd walked these trails hundreds of times before, but today the air felt charged with an inexplicable energy. Probably just the weather, Philip muttered to himself, trying to shake off the eerie sensation. He'd always prided himself on his rational mind, a trait that had served him well in his police career. There was no room for flights of fancy when dealing with the gritty realities of law enforcement. As he crested a small hill, the mist parted briefly, revealing the outline of the Cow and Calf rocks in the distance. Philip paused, taking in the view. The massive gritstone formations, said to resemble a cow and its calf, had stood sentinel over Ilkley Moor for millennia. Local legend held that the rocks were split by the giant Rombold as he fled an angry wife. Philip had always found such tales amusing, rather than convincing. He continued his walk, passing by the ancient cup and ring marks carved into some of the rocks. These mysterious Bronze Age petroglyphs had puzzled archaeologists for generations. Philip ran his hand over one of the designs, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time and countless curious touches like his own. "If only you could talk," he said to the stone. "What secrets would you tell?" As if in response, a gust of wind swept across the moor, carrying with it the faint sound of something. Philip cocked his head, straining to hear. It wasn't quite a whistle, nor a hum, but something in between, and it seemed to be coming from up ahead. Curiosity piqued. Philip quickened his pace. The sound grew louder as he approached a dip in the landscape where the mist seemed to gather more thickly. He squinted, trying to penetrate the foggy veil. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't quite match its surroundings. "Hello?" he called out, his police instincts kicking in. "Is someone there?" The strange sound abruptly ceased. The moor fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the rapid beating of Philip's heart. He took another step forward and then froze. There, emerging from the mist like a figure from a half-remembered dream, was a shape. At first, Philip's mind to categorize it as something familiar. A child, perhaps, or a hunched old person. But as the figure came into clearer view, he realized with a jolt that it was like nothing he had ever seen before. It stood no more than 4 feet tall, with skin that seemed to shimmer with a greenish tint in the weak morning light. Its head was disproportionately large and bulbous, perched atop a thin neck. But it was the eyes that truly captured Philip's attention. Large, black, and utterly alien. They regarded him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Philip Spencer stood face to face with the impossible. All his years of rational thinking, all his dismissals of fantastical claims, crumbled in the face of the undeniable reality before him. Then, operating on pure instinct, Philip reached for the camera he always carried on his walks. His fingers fumbled with the device, his eyes never leaving the strange being. Just as he raised the camera to his eye, the creature lifted a long, spindly arm in what could have been a gesture of warning or greeting. The shutter clicked, capturing the moment forever. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the being turned and fled, movements fluid and unnaturally quick. Philip stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The mist swirled around him, as if trying to erase all evidence of the encounter. The real shock was yet to come. For as Philip finally gathered his wits and moved to pursue the creature, a sound split the air. A deep, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He looked up, his jaw dropping in disbelief. Rising from behind a nearby hill, a bright, saucer-shaped craft breached the mist. It hovered for a moment, pulsing with an otherworldly light, or shooting upwards at an impossible speed. In the blink of an eye it was gone, leaving only a rapidly dispersing ripple in the fog to mark its passing. Philip Spencer stood alone on Ilkley Moor, camera clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The world as he knew it had just changed irrevocably, and he had no idea what to do next. As the last echoes of the strange craft's departure faded away, Philip became acutely aware of the oppressive silence that had fallen over the moor. Even the usual morning birdsong seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath in the wake of the extraordinary event. He looked down at the camera in his hands, half expecting it to have transformed into something alien itself. But it remained stubbornly ordinary, offering no hint of the potentially world-changing image it now contained. "Get a grip, Spencer," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's got to be a rational explanation for this." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. What he had seen defied any rational explanation he could conjure. The creature's otherworldly appearance, the impossible speed and maneuverability of the craft, these were not things that could be easily dismissed or explained away. With legs that suddenly felt leaden, Philip began to make his way towards East Morton, where his father-in-law lived. He had planned to stop in for a cup of tea before heading home, but now the visit took on a new urgency. He needed to talk to someone, anchor himself in the familiar and mundane before he could begin to process what had just occurred. As he walked, Philip's mind raced. Should he report what he had seen? Who would even believe him? He had spent his entire career as a policeman dealing in facts and evidence, and now he found himself in possession of an experience flew in the face of everything he thought he knew about the world. The mist began to thin as he neared East Morton, familiar outlines of the village coming into view. Philip checked his watch, frowning as he realized more time had passed than he had thought. But as he looked more closely at the watch face, his frown deepened. The hands seemed to be moving erratically, spinning backwards and forwards as if caught in some kind of temporal distortion. "What the hell?" Philip muttered, tapping the watch face. But the erratic movement continued. A chill that had nothing to do with the December air ran down his spine as he realized that this, too, must be connected to his encounter on the moor. As Philip approached his father-in-law's cottage, he tried to compose himself. George Thompson was a no-nonsense sort of man, not given to flights of fancy. How could Philip even begin to explain what had happened? He raised his hand to knock on the door, then hesitated. The weight of his experience pressed down on him, isolating him from the normal world around him. For a moment, he considered turning around, heading home, and pretending none of this had ever happened. But then the door opened and George's familiar face appeared, lined with concern. "Philip? What are you doing here so late? Margaret's been trying to reach you all morning." Philip blinked in confusion. "Late? But it's only..." He trailed off as he noticed the clock on the wall behind George. It showed a time several hours later than it should have been. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Not only had he seen something impossible on the moor, but he had lost time, hours of it, with no recollection of where it had gone. As he stood there on the threshold, caught between the familiar world of his father-in-law's cottage and the alien experience he had just undergone, Philip Spencer realized that his life would never be the same again. The mists of Ilkley Moor had parted to reveal a reality far stranger and more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a question that would haunt him in the days and weeks to come. What else had happened during those missing hours? Chapter 2: The Sighting. Philip Spencer stood frozen on his father-in-law's doorstep, his mind reeling from the dual shocks of his otherworldly encounter and the realization that hours had inexplicably vanished from his morning. George Thompson's weathered face creased with concern as he took in his son-in-law's disheveled appearance. "Come in, lad," George said, gently pulling Philip inside. "You look like you've seen a ghost." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Philip's throat. A ghost would have been easier to explain, easier to dismiss. But he swallowed it down, allowing himself to be led to the worn armchair by the fireplace. "What's happened, Philip?" George asked, pressing a steaming mug of tea into his hands. Margaret's been beside herself with worry. Philip's fingers tightened around the mug, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in his bones. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could he possibly explain what he had seen? I'm not sure, he finally managed. Something happened on the moor, something I can't explain. George leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. What do you mean? Were you hurt? Philip shook his head. No, not hurt. But, he took a deep breath, steeling himself. I saw something, George, something that shouldn't exist. As the words began to flow, Philip found himself recounting the events of the morning in vivid detail. He described the eerie mist, the strange sound that had drawn him forward, and then, with halting words, the appearance of the alien being. It was small, no more than 4 feet tall, Philip said, his voice barely above a whisper. But its head, it was too big, bulbous. And its skin, George, its skin was green. George's eyebrows shot up, but he remained silent, letting Philip continue. The eyes were the worst part, Philip went on, suppressing a shudder. Black, huge, like nothing I've ever seen before. They looked intelligent, aware. He described the creature's flight and then, with growing agitation, the appearance of the UFO. It was just there, rising up from behind the hill, Philip said, gesticulating with his free hand. A bright, saucer-shaped thing. It hovered for a moment, then shot straight up into the sky, faster than anything I've ever seen. George sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. That's quite a tale, Philip, he said slowly. Philip leaned forward, his eyes pleading. I know how it sounds, George, believe me I do. If someone had told me the story yesterday, I'd have thought they were mad or having me on. But I swear to you, it's the truth. George was silent for a long moment, studying Philip's face. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. I believe you believe it, lad, he said softly. But have you considered that there might be another explanation? Stress, maybe? Or... I took a photograph, Philip interrupted, suddenly remembering the camera that still hung around his neck. His hands shook as he raised it, turning it on to view the digital display. But as he scrolled through the images, his heart sank. Most of the photos were blurry landscapes, fog-shrouded rocks, and indistinct shapes in the mist. And then there it was, a single grainy image that showed something. Philip squinted at the small screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. In the center of the frame, partially obscured by mist, was a vaguely humanoid shape. It was small, with an oversized head, just as he remembered, but the details were frustratingly unclear. Figure more of a silhouette than a clear image. Here, Philip said, thrusting the camera towards George. Look at this. George took the camera, peering at the image with a frown. It's certainly unusual, he admitted after a moment. But Philip, it could be anything. Child in a costume, maybe. Or just a trick of the light and fog. Philip snatched the camera back, staring at the image. He knew what he had seen, knew that this blurry photo didn't do justice to the reality of his encounter, but he could also see how, to someone who hadn't been there, it might not be convincing. I know what I saw, he said firmly, lowering the camera. And I know what I experienced. Those missing hours, George, my watch going haywire, it all adds up to something. Something beyond our understanding. George sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, Philip, you're a good man and a rational one. I've never known you to make up stories or be given to flights of fancy. But what you're suggesting, it's extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Philip nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He had known, deep down, that it wouldn't be easy to convince others of what he had seen. But hearing the doubt in George's voice made the reality of his situation hit home. What should I do? He asked, hating how lost he sounded. George stood up, placing a comforting hand on Philip's shoulder. For now, go home, talk to Margaret, get some rest. Maybe things will look clearer in the morning. Philip nodded numbly, rising to his feet. As he made his way to the door, George called after him. And Philip, maybe keep this between us for now, eh? At least until you've had a chance to think it through. As Philip stepped back out into the chilly afternoon air, he felt the weight of his experience pressing down on him. The world looked the same, familiar streets of East Morton, the distant outline of the moor, but everything had changed. He began the walk home, his mind churning with questions. What had really happened on the moor? What did the creature want? And most pressingly, what had occurred during those missing hours? One thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. As he walked, Philip made a silent vow to himself. He would get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter what it took. He would find proof, real, incontrovertible evidence of what he had seen. Little did he know that his quest for answers would lead him down a path stranger and more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The sighting on Ilkley Moor was just the beginning. First step on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Philip Spencer walked home, carrying with him a secret that would change not just his life, potentially the course of human history. The truth was out there, hidden in the mists of Ilkley Moor, and he was determined to find it. Chapter 3. Lost Time. The walk home from East Morton felt interminable to Philip Spencer. Each step seemed to take him further from the familiar world he had known this morning, and deeper into a reality he no longer recognized. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful sight that Philip barely registered as his mind churned with the events of the day. As he approached his modest home on the outskirts of Ilkley, Philip's stomach tightened with anxiety. How could he explain to Margaret what had happened? Would she believe him, or would she react with the same skepticism as her father? Before he could reach for his keys, the front door flew open. Margaret stood there, her face a mask of worry and relief. "Philip, where on earth have you been? I've been calling and calling." Her words cut off as she took in his appearance, a haunted look in his eyes, the disheveled state of his clothes. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice dropping to a concerned whisper. Philip stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The familiar sense of home, Margaret's lavender perfume, the lingering aroma of morning coffee, seemed somehow alien now, as if belonging to a life he no longer fully inhabited. "Maggie," he began, his voice hoarse, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. It's going to sound mad, but I swear to you, it's the truth." Margaret's brow furrowed, but she nodded, leading him to the living room sofa. As they sat, Philip took a deep breath and began to recount his experience on the moor. He spoke of the misty morning, the eerie atmosphere that had seemed charged with an inexplicable energy. He described the strange sound that had drawn him forward, and then, haltingly, he told her about the creature. "It was like nothing I've ever seen before, Maggie," Philip said, his eyes pleading for understanding. Small, with green skin and a huge head, and its eyes? They were so intelligent, so aware. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something else entirely. Margaret listened in stunned silence, her face a kaleidoscope of emotions: concern, disbelief, and a growing fear. When Philip described the UFO rising from behind the hill, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "And then," Philip continued, his voice dropping, "I lost time. Hours of it. I have no idea what happened between seeing that craft disappear into the sky and arriving at your father's house." As he finished his account, the room fell into a heavy silence. Margaret sat motionless, her eyes wide and unfocused as she processed what she had heard. "Philip," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure? I mean, absolutely sure about what you saw?" Philip nodded emphatically. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Maggie. I know how it sounds, believe me. But it happened. It was real." Margaret stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "But it can't be real, Phil. Aliens? UFOs? These things don't happen. Not here, not to us." "I took a photo," Philip said, reaching for his camera. But as he scrolled to the image and showed it to Margaret, he felt a sinking in his stomach. The blurry, indistinct shape seemed even less convincing now than it had earlier. Margaret squinted at the image, then looked back at Philip, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "I don't see anything, Phil, just fog and maybe a shadow. This doesn't prove anything." Philip's frustration bubbled to the surface. "I know what I saw, Margaret. This photo doesn't do it justice, but it was there. Creature, the craft, all of it. And those missing hours. How do you explain that?" Margaret sat back down, taking Philip's hands in hers. "Love, I'm not saying you're lying. I know you believe what you're telling me. But have you considered that there might be another explanation? Stress, maybe?" Or I'm not crazy, Maggie, Philip interrupted, voice tight with emotion. And I wasn't hallucinating. This happened. Margaret squeezed his hands. Okay, let's think about this logically. You said you lost time, right? Maybe you fell and hit your head. That could explain the missing hours and even the strange visions. Philip shook his head vehemently. No, that's not it. I don't have any injuries, no headache, nothing. And it doesn't explain my watch malfunctioning or the compass going haywire. As if to emphasize his point, Philip pulled out his watch. The hands were still moving erratically, spinning backwards and forwards without any discernible pattern. Margaret's eyes widened as she watched the bizarre display. That's not normal, she admitted, her voice shaky. Philip nodded grimly. None of this is normal, Maggie. Something happened out there on the moor, something beyond our understanding, and I need to find out what it was. Margaret's face paled. What do you mean, find out? Philip, you can't seriously be thinking of pursuing this? I have to, Philip said, his voice filled with a determination that surprised even him. I can't just ignore what happened. Those missing hours, Maggie. What if something else occurred during that time? What if there's more to this than I can remember? Margaret stood up again, wrapping her arms around herself, as if suddenly cold. This isn't like you, Phil. You've always been so rational, so grounded. And now you're talking about chasing aliens and lost time? I'm worried about you. Philip felt a pang of guilt at the fear in his wife's voice. He stood, crossing the room to embrace her. I know this is hard to believe, love, and I know it's scary. Terrifying me too, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I need answers. Margaret leaned into him, her voice muffled against his chest. What are you gonna do? Philip took a deep breath. First, I need to get this photo analyzed properly. There must be experts who can enhance the image, see if there's more detail we're missing. And then, I don't know, but I'll figure it out. As they stood there in their living room, holding each other tightly, Philip felt the weight of his experience settling over them like a shroud. He knew that pursuing the truth about what happened on Ilkley Moor could change everything. His life, his relationships, perhaps even his understanding of the universe itself. But he also knew he had no choice. The memory of those alien eyes, intelligent and unknowable, haunted him. The lost hours loomed in his mind like a dark chasm, filled with possibilities both wondrous and terrifying. Whatever had happened on Ilkley Moor that misty morning, whatever strange encounter had torn a hole in the fabric of Philip Spencer's reality, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As night fell over Ilkley, Philip and Margaret Spencer clung to each other, both aware that they stood on the precipice of something vast and unknown. The truth was out there, hidden in the mists of time and memory, and Philip was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Chapter 4: The Photograph. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Philip Spencer's mood as he sat at the kitchen table, staring intently at his camera. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events on the moor in an endless loop. Margaret moved around the kitchen, the clatter of dishes and the rich aroma of coffee providing a veneer of normalcy that felt almost surreal in contrast to Philip's inner turmoil. I'm going to develop the film today, Philip announced, breaking the tense silence that had settled between them since their conversation the night before. Margaret paused in her morning routine, a mug of coffee halfway to her lips. Are you sure that's wise, Phil? Maybe we should just let this go for now. Give it some time. Philip shook his head firmly. I can't, Maggie. I need to know. If there's any chance that this photo shows what I saw, I have to pursue it. Margaret sighed, setting down her mug. And if it doesn't? If the photo shows nothing, what then? Then I'll know I need to look for answers elsewhere, Philip replied, his jaw set with determination. But I have to start somewhere. As Margaret left for work, her goodbye kiss tinged with worry, Philip gathered his camera and headed into town. The streets of Ilkley were beginning to bustle with morning activity. Philip barely noticed, his mind focused solely on his mission. He made his way to Reshapes, the local camera shop where he'd been a regular customer for years. Bell above the door jingled as he entered, and Tom, the elderly proprietor, looked up with a smile. Philip, good to see you, lad. What can I do for you today? Philip approached the counter, his heart racing. Morning, Tom. I need to develop some film. It's important. Tom's bushy eyebrows rose at Philip's serious tone. Must be quite the photo shoot. Special occasion? You could say that. Philip replied evasively. How quickly can you do it? Sensing Philip's urgency, Tom nodded. For you, I can have it done in a couple of hours. Why don't you come back around lunchtime? Philip agreed, handing over his camera with shaking hands. As he turned to leave, Tom called after him. Everything all right, Philip? You seem a bit out of sorts. Philip forced a smile. Just eager to see the results, Tom. Thanks for rushing it. The next 2 hours were some of the longest of Philip's life. He wandered the streets of Ilkley aimlessly, his mind racing with possibilities. What if the photo showed nothing? What if it revealed something so extraordinary that he couldn't keep it to himself? The weight of potential discovery pressed down on him, making each minute feel like an eternity. Finally, it was time. Philip all but ran back to Reshapes, bursting through the door with such force that the bell nearly flew off its mounting. Tom was waiting for him, a large envelope in his hands and an odd expression on his face. They're ready, Philip, but... But what? Philip asked, his heart in his throat. Tom shook his head, bewildered. I've never seen anything quite like it. Most of the shots are just landscapes, but there's one, well, you'd better take a look for yourself. With trembling fingers, Philip opened the envelope and spread the photographs on the counter. He flipped through shots of misty moorland and fog-shrouded rocks until he came to it, the photo that could change everything. There, in the center of the frame, was a figure. It was blurry and indistinct, partially obscured by mist, but unmistakably present. The proportions were all wrong for a human. A large, bulbous head atop a small body with long, spindly arms. And was that a greenish tint to the skin, or just a trick of the light? Philip's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't as clear as he'd hoped, but it was something. Proof that he hadn't imagined the whole encounter. What do you make of this, Tom? Philip asked, his voice hoarse. Tom leaned in, squinting at the photo. I'm not sure what to think, Philip. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. Could be a costume, I suppose, or some kind of optical illusion. But it's strange, no doubt about that. Philip nodded, his mind racing. Could you make some copies of this one? And is there any way to enhance it? To see more detail? Tom scratched his head. I can make copies, sure. As for enhancing it, well, I'm not an expert in that sort of thing. But I know someone who might be able to help. Let me make a call. As Tom stepped away to use the phone, Philip continued to stare at the photograph. It wasn't definitive proof. Could already imagine the skeptical explanations people might offer. But it was a start. Tangible piece of evidence that something truly extraordinary had occurred on Ilkley Moor. Tom returned a few minutes later. I've spoken to a friend of mine in Leeds. He's a bit of a whiz with photo analysis and enhancement, says he'd be happy to take a look if you're interested. Philip nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. When can we go? Tom chuckled at Philip's enthusiasm. Hold your horses, lad. He said he can see us tomorrow afternoon. That work for you? Philip agreed, his mind already leaping ahead to what the enhanced photo might reveal. As he left the shop, copies of the photograph tucked safely in his jacket, he felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He was one step closer to unraveling the mystery of his encounter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was also stepping into something much larger and potentially more dangerous than he could imagine. That evening, as Philip showed the developed photograph to Margaret, he saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. The image, while strange, wasn't the irrefutable proof he had hoped for. It's certainly unusual, Margaret said carefully, studying the photo. But Phil, it could be anything, a person in a costume, or just a trick of the light and fog. Philip felt a flash of frustration. I know what I saw, Maggie. This photo might not be perfect, but it's something. And tomorrow, we might be able to see even more. Margaret looked up sharply. Tomorrow? What do you mean? Philip explained about Tom's friend in Leeds, the photo enhancement expert. As he spoke, he saw worry creep into Margaret's eyes. Philip, I'm concerned, she said, setting the photo down. This obsession, it's not like you. What if this leads nowhere? Or worse, what if it leads somewhere you're not prepared for? Philip took her hands in his, meeting her gaze steadily. I know you're worried, love, but I have to see this through. There's even a chance that what I saw was real, that it could change everything we know about the world. I have to pursue it. Margaret squeezed his hands, her expression torn between love and fear. Just be careful, Phil. Promise me you won't let this consume you. Philip nodded, Ishamal pulling her into an embrace. But even as he held his wife, his eyes strayed to the photograph on the table. The blurry figure seemed to stare back at him, a silent challenge to uncover the truth hidden in the mists of Ilkley Moor. As night fell over their home, Philip Spencer stood on the precipice of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world and himself. The photograph was just the beginning, the first piece of a puzzle that would lead him into realms of mystery and danger he could scarcely imagine. Tomorrow, he would take the next step into the unknown, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. Enter the Investigators. The drive to Leeds the following afternoon was tense, with Philip's excitement and Margaret's apprehension creating a palpable atmosphere in the car. The cityscape gradually replaced the rolling hills of Ilkley, but Philip's mind remained firmly on the moor and the extraordinary encounter that had brought him here. Tom had given them an address in a nondescript industrial area on the outskirts of Leeds. As they pulled up to a weathered brick building, Philip couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. Was this really the place? Are you sure this is right? Margaret asked, echoing his thoughts. Philip double-checked the address. This is it. Come on, let's go in. They approached a heavy metal door with a small intercom panel. Philip pressed the button, and after a moment, a crackling voice emerged. Yes? Hello, Philip said, leaning closer to the speaker. I'm Philip Spencer. Tom from Reshapes in Ilkley sent us about a photograph. There was a pause, then a buzzing sound as the door unlocked. I'm in. 3rd floor. Philip and Margaret exchanged glances before stepping inside. The interior was as uninspiring as the exterior, bare concrete walls and flickering fluorescent lights. They took the creaking elevator to the 3rd floor, where they found themselves in a long corridor lined with doors. One door stood ajar, and as they approached, they heard the whirring of computer fans and the click of a keyboard. Philip knocked tentatively. Come in. A voice called from inside. They entered a room that was a stark contrast to the building's dreary exterior. The space was filled with high-tech equipment, computers with multiple monitors, sophisticated-looking scanners, and devices Philip couldn't even begin to identify. A man swiveled in his chair to face them. He was younger than Philip had expected, probably in his early 30s, with wild red hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He grinned as he stood to greet them. You must be Philip. I'm Dr. Alan Fitzgerald, but please call me Alan. Tom's told me you have quite the interesting photograph. Philip nodded, reaching into his jacket to retrieve the envelope containing the photo. Yes, it's unlike anything I've ever seen before. Alan's eyes lit up with curiosity. Well, let's have a look then, shall we? As Alan examined the photograph, his expression shifted from interest to intense concentration. He placed the photo on a high-resolution scanner, and soon multiple versions of the image appeared on his computer screens, each processed differently. Fascinating, Alan murmured, more to himself than to his guests. Figure's proportions are highly unusual, and there's something about the way it interacts with the mist, most intriguing. Philip leaned in, his heart racing. Can you tell what it is? Alan shook his head slowly. Not definitively, no. But I can tell you this, whatever it is, it's not a common photographic anomaly or a simple trick of the light. There's substance here. He turned to face Philip and Margaret. Mr. Spencer, would you mind telling me exactly what you saw when you took this photograph? Philip hesitated, glancing at Margaret. She gave him a small nod, and he took a deep breath before recounting the events on Ilkley Moor. As he spoke, Alan's eyes grew wider, and he began taking rapid notes. When Philip finished, Alan sat back in his chair, looking thoughtful. Mr. Spencer, what you're describing, it aligns with numerous accounts of close encounters that I've studied over the years. Margaret spoke up for the first time since entering the office. Studied? Are you saying you're some kind of UFO expert? Alan smiled wryly. I prefer the term anomalous phenomena researcher, but yes, that's part of what I do. My background is in physics and computer science, but I've always been fascinated by the unexplained. When Tom called me about your photo, I had a feeling it might be something special. He turned back to his computers, typing rapidly. I'm going to run some more advanced enhancement algorithms on this image. It'll take some time, but it might reveal details we can't see with the naked eye." As Alan worked, Philip and Margaret sat in stunned silence. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. They had stumbled into a world of UFO research and alien encounters, a world that until 2 days ago, Philip would have dismissed as pure fantasy. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes, Alan beckoned them over to his main screen. "Take a look at this," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. The enhanced image was clearer than Philip could have hoped for. The figure's alien features were more defined: the large, bulbous head, the spindly limbs, and most strikingly, the large, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. "My God," Philip breathed. "That's it. That's exactly what I saw." Margaret gripped Philip's arm tightly, her face pale. "It's real," she whispered. "It's actually real." Alan nodded, his expression serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Spencer, what we have here is potentially groundbreaking evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. This could change everything we think we know about our place in the universe." He turned to face them fully. "I have colleagues, serious researchers in the field of ufology, who would be very interested in investigating this further. With your permission, I'd like to reach out to them." Philip felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was what he had wanted: validation, a chance to uncover the truth. But he also felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Whatever had happened on Ilkley Moor, whatever that creature was, the implications were enormous. I need to think about it," Philip said finally. "This is all happening so fast." Alan nodded understandingly. "Course, take some time to process this, but please consider allowing us to investigate further. This could be the evidence we've been waiting for." As they left Alan's office, copies of the enhanced photograph in hand, Philip and Margaret were silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The world seemed different now, larger and more mysterious than they had ever imagined. Back in the car, Margaret turned to Philip, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "What are we going to do, Phil?" Philip stared at the photograph in his hands, the alien eyes seeming to challenge him. "We're going to find the truth, Maggie," he said softly, "whatever it takes." As they drove back to Ilkley, the cityscape giving way to familiar hills, Philip knew that their lives had changed irrevocably. The mystery of Ilkley Moor was just beginning to unfold, and he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter where it might lead. Chapter 6: Media Frenzy. The following days passed in a blur for Philip and Margaret Spencer. After much discussion and soul-searching, they had decided to allow Alan Fitzgerald to share their story with his colleagues in the UFO research community. What they hadn't anticipated was how quickly the information would spread beyond that tight-knit circle. It started with a phone call from a local reporter. Somehow, word of Philip's encounter and the mysterious photograph had leaked. Before they knew it, their quiet life in Ilkley had been turned upside down. The doorbell rang incessantly, with journalists from local papers and even national tabloids clamoring for interviews. Philip's phone buzzed constantly with calls from unknown numbers. Even their neighbors, once friendly and unobtrusive, now watched their house with poorly disguised curiosity. "This is madness," Margaret said, peeking through the curtains at the small group of reporters camped out on their front lawn. "How did this happen, Phil?" Philip ran a hand through his hair, looking haggard. "I don't know, Maggie. I thought we could control this, keep it contained. I never imagined it would blow up like this." Just then, the phone rang again. Philip answered it wearily, expecting another pushy journalist. Instead, he heard Alan Fitzgerald's apologetic voice. "Mr. Spencer, I can't tell you how sorry I am," Alan said. "One of my colleagues must have leaked the story. I never intended for this to happen." Philip sighed heavily. "I know you didn't, Alan, but what do we do now? They're not going to just go away." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Perhaps it's time to tell your story, Mr. Spencer. On your own terms." After a long discussion with Margaret, Philip agreed to give a single interview to a respected local journalist named Sarah Thompson. They hoped that by controlling the narrative, they could quell some of the wild speculation that had begun to circulate. Sarah arrived the next morning, looking professional and sympathetic. As they settled in the living room, Philip couldn't help but feel a sense of surreality. How had he gone from a quiet, retired policeman to the center of a UFO controversy in less than a week? "Mr. Spencer," Sarah began, voice gentle but probing, "can you tell me exactly what happened on Ilkley Moor that morning?" Philip took a deep breath and recounted his experience once again. As he spoke, he could see Sarah's professional detachment wavering, her eyes widening at the details of his encounter. When he finished, Sarah was silent for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "And the photograph?" she asked finally. "May I see it?" Philip nodded, retrieving the enhanced version that Alan had provided. As Sarah examined it, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is remarkable," she said softly. "Have you had it analyzed?" Philip explained about Alan Fitzgerald and the enhancements he had performed. Sarah listened intently, taking copious notes. "Mr. Spencer," she said finally, looking up from her notepad, "you must understand how extraordinary these claims are. What would you say to those who might be skeptical of your story?" Philip leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I would say that I understand their skepticism. A week ago, I would have been skeptical too, but I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And while this photograph might not be conclusive proof, it's evidence that something truly unusual occurred on Ilkley Moor." The interview continued for over 2 hours, with Sarah probing every detail of Philip's encounter and its aftermath. As she was preparing to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Spencer," she said, her expression serious, "I want you to be prepared. This story, it's going to be big. Bigger than Ilkley, bigger than Yorkshire. Are you ready for that?" Philip and Margaret exchanged glances. Were they ready? Could anyone truly be ready for something like this? "We have to be," Philip said finally. "The truth is too important to hide." Sarah nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "For what it's worth, I believe you, Mr. Spencer. And I'll do my best to tell your story fairly." As the door closed behind Sarah, Philip and Margaret stood in silence, the weight of what was to come settling over them like a heavy cloak. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Margaret asked softly. Philip pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I hope so, love. I really hope so." The article hit the newsstands 2 days later, and the effect was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah had done an admirable job of presenting Philip's account objectively, but the story was sensational enough on its own to cause a media firestorm. National newspapers picked up the story, running headlines like "Yorkshire's Close Encounter" and "Alien on the Moor." Television news crews descended on Ilkley, turning their quiet town into a circus of reporters, UFO enthusiasts, and curious onlookers. But with the increased attention came increased scrutiny. Skeptics began to weigh in, offering alternative explanations for Philip's experience and the photograph. "It's clearly a hoax," declared Thomas Watterson, a local skeptic who had become a fixture on news programs. "A man in a costume, or perhaps a cleverly constructed model. The photograph proves nothing." Others suggested that Philip had experienced a vivid hallucination, possibly brought on by stress or an undiagnosed medical condition. Some even hinted at deliberate deception, questioning Philip's motives and character. The pressure began to take its toll. Philip found himself second-guessing every detail of his encounter, questioning his own memories. Margaret stood by him resolutely, but he could see the strain in her eyes, hear the wariness in her voice as she fielded yet another phone call from a persistent reporter. As the media frenzy reached its peak, Philip received an unexpected call. It was Peter Ho, a well-known UFO researcher whose work Philip had begun to read voraciously since his encounter. "Mr. Spencer," Peter said, voice calm and authoritative, "I've been following your story with great interest. I believe you've experienced something truly extraordinary. I'd like to help you investigate further. Would you be willing to meet with me and my colleague, Jenny Randalls?" For the first time since the media storm had begun, Philip felt a glimmer of hope. Here, perhaps, were people who could help him make sense of what had happened, who could help him uncover the truth behind his encounter on Ilkley Moor. "Yes," Philip said, new determination in his voice. "Yes, I'd like that very much." As he hung up the phone, Philip gazed out the window at the reporters still camped on his lawn. The world had changed irrevocably since that misty morning on the moor. But now, with the help of experienced investigators, perhaps he could finally begin to understand the truth behind his extraordinary encounter. The journey that had begun in the mists of Ilkley Moor was far from over. In fact, Philip realized it was only just beginning. Chapter 7. The Hypnosis Session. The meeting with Peter Ho and Jenny Randalls marked a turning point in Philip Spencer's quest for answers. The two researchers brought a level of professionalism and expertise that helped to counterbalance the circus-like atmosphere that had engulfed Philip's life since his story went public. Peter, tall man with a thoughtful demeanor, and Jenny, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of quiet determination, listened intently as Philip recounted his experience once again. Their questions were probing but respectful, their manner reassuring. "Mr. Spencer," Jenny said after Philip had finished, "your account aligns with many other close encounter experiences we've investigated. But there's one aspect that particularly interests us: missing time." Philip nodded, a chill running down his spine at the mention of those lost hours. "It's the part that frightens me the most," he admitted. Not knowing what happened, Peter leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's a technique we've used in similar cases that might help recover those memories. Have you ever considered undergoing hypnotic regression?" Margaret, who had been silent throughout most of the meeting, spoke up. "Hypnosis? Is that safe?" Jenny turned to her with a reassuring smile. "When conducted by a trained professional, yes, we work with a hypnotherapist who specializes in recovering repressed memories. Of course, it's entirely up to Philip whether he wants to try it." Philip felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The idea of uncovering what had happened during those missing hours both excited and terrified. But the need to know outweighed his fear. "I'll do it," he said firmly. The hypnosis session was scheduled for the following week. As the day approached, Philip found himself increasingly anxious. What if he remembered something horrible? What if he remembered nothing at all? On the morning of the session, Philip and Margaret arrived at a nondescript office building in Manchester. They were greeted by Peter and Jenny, who introduced them to Dr. James Singleton, calm, soft-spoken man with kind eyes. "Remember, Mr. Spencer," Dr. Singleton said as Philip settled into a comfortable recliner, "you are always in control. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or want to stop, just say so." Philip nodded, taking a deep breath as he closed his eyes. Dr. Singleton's voice became soothing, guiding Philip into a state of deep relaxation. The outside world faded away and Philip found himself back on Ilkley Moor, reliving that fateful morning. "You've just seen the strange creature." Dr. Singleton's voice came from far away. "What happens next, Philip?" Philip's brow furrowed in concentration. The being, it's raising its hand, not threatening, more like a greeting. Or a warning, I'm not sure. And then, a light, so bright, it's coming from behind the hill, the craft, rising up, it's beautiful and terrifying all at once. Dr. Singleton's voice remained calm. "What do you do, Philip?" I'm running towards it. I don't know why, it's like I'm being pulled. The light, it's enveloping me. I can't see anything else." Philip's breathing became rapid, his fingers gripping the armrests of the chair. "It's okay, Philip," Dr. Singleton soothed. "You're safe. What's happening now?" "I'm inside the craft. It's larger than it looked from outside. The walls are curved, seamless. There's a humming sound, but I feel it more than hear it." The others in the room exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of awe and concern. "Are you alone, Philip?" Dr. Singleton prompted. Philip's head moved from side to side. "No, they're here. 3 of them, like the one I saw on the moor, but different somehow. Taller. Their eyes, so much intelligence in those eyes." "What are they doing, Philip?" A look of concentration passed over Philip's face. "They're communicating. Not with words. Images, feelings, they're showing me things." "What kind of things?" Philip's expression became distressed. "Destruction. Cities in ruins, oceans rising, fires consuming forests. It's the future. Our future." Margaret let out a small gasp, quickly stifled. Peter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Is there more, Philip?" Dr. Singleton asked gently. "Yes, another image. Earth but healed, green, peaceful. They're showing 2 paths, a warning and a hope." Philip's breathing began to slow, his grip on the chair relaxing. "The light again," he murmured. "So bright. And then, I'm back on the moor, confused, disoriented. My watch is spinning. I don't understand what's happened. Dr. Singleton's voice became more assertive. All right, Philip, I want you to take a deep breath. When I count to 3, you'll wake up, feeling refreshed and calm. 1, 2, 3. Philip's eyes fluttered open. He looked around the room, seeming surprised to find himself back in the office. Did it work? He asked hesitantly. The stunned expressions on the faces of those around him were answer enough. Over the next hour, Dr. Singleton, Peter, and Jenny carefully debriefed Philip, going over every detail of what he had recalled under hypnosis. Margaret sat close to her husband, her hand clasped tightly in his. This is extraordinary, Peter said finally. The level of detail, the consistency with other close encounter reports. Mr. Spencer, I believe you've experienced something truly remarkable. Jenny nodded in agreement. The apocalyptic visions, the dual future scenarios, these align with messages reported in other cases. Seems the beings were trying to communicate a warning about humanity's future. Philip sat in stunned silence, trying to process the flood of recovered memories. The experience felt both intensely real and dreamlike, as if he had lived through another person's memories. What do we do with this information? Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. Peter and Jenny exchanged glances. That's up to you, Jenny said gently. We can continue to investigate, to try and corroborate your experience with other reports. But ultimately, it's your story to tell or not tell. As they left the office, Philip felt as if the world had shifted on its axis once again. The recovered memories of his time aboard the craft, the apocalyptic visions he had been shown, it was almost too much to comprehend. Are you all right, love? Margaret asked as they drove home, concern evident in her voice. Philip was silent for a long moment, staring out at the passing landscape. Finally, he turned to her, his expression a mixture of wonder and determination. I think I understand now, Maggie. Why this happened to me. Why they chose to make contact. It wasn't just about revealing their existence. They were trying to warn us, to show us what could happen if we don't change our ways. He reached out, taking her hand. We have a responsibility now, to share this message, to try and make a difference. It won't be easy, and not everyone will believe us, but we have to try. Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and resolve. Whatever happens, we'll face it together, she said softly. As they drove back towards Ilkley, the sun setting behind the distant hills, Philip Spencer knew that his journey was far from over. The encounter on the moor, the recovered memories, the apocalyptic visions, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that he was now determined to solve. The truth was out there, hidden in the stars and in the mists of Ilkley Moor, and Philip was more committed than ever to uncovering it, no matter where the quest might lead. Chapter 8. Aftermath and Doubt. The days following the hypnosis session were a whirlwind of emotions for Philip and Margaret Spencer. The recovered memories of Philip's time aboard the alien craft had answered some questions, but had also opened up a Pandora's box of new ones. The weight of the apocalyptic visions and the sense of responsibility they now felt hung heavily over their household. Philip found himself poring over his recollections obsessively, jotting down every detail he could remember in a worn notebook. Margaret watched with growing concern as her husband became increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours in his study, surrounded by books on UFOs, climate change, and apocalyptic predictions. One evening, as Philip sat at the kitchen table, absently pushing his dinner around his plate, Margaret decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. Phil, she said softly, reaching out to touch his hand. We need to talk about this. Philip looked up, seeming to come back from a far-off place. What is it, love? Margaret took a deep breath. I'm worried about you, about us. This obsession, it's consuming you. Philip's brow furrowed. Obsession? Maggie, this is important. What I saw, what they showed me, we can't just ignore it. I'm not saying we should ignore it, Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice calm. But Phil, look at what it's doing to our lives. The media circus, the constant phone calls, the way people look at us in town. And now, since the hypnosis, you're barely sleeping, barely eating. Philip pushed his plate away, a flash of frustration crossing his face. What would you have me do, Maggie? Pretend it never happened? Go back to our quiet retirement like I didn't see a vision of the world in flames? Margaret flinched at his tone. Course not. But Phil, we need to find a balance. We need to live our lives too. As the words left her mouth, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Philip rose to answer it, leaving Margaret sitting at the table, a mixture of worry and frustration etched on her face. Moments later, Philip returned, followed by Peter Ho and Jenny Randalls. The two researchers looked grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Spencer," Peter began, "we apologize for the intrusion, but something's come up that we thought you should know about immediately." Jenny pulled out a newspaper. Laying it on the table, the headline screamed, "Ilkley Moor UFO, Hoax or Mass Hysteria." Philip snatched up the paper, his face darkening as he read. The article cited anonymous sources claiming that Philip had a history of attention-seeking behavior and mental health issues. It also quoted several psychologists, suggesting that the entire event, including the hypnosis session, could be explained as a form of shared delusion or mass hysteria. "This is ridiculous," Philip spat, throwing the paper down. "It's all lies." Peter nodded sympathetically. "We know, Mr. Spencer. But I'm afraid this is just the beginning. The skeptics are mobilizing, and they're not pulling any punches." Jenny leaned forward, her expression serious. "We've also received word that a group of debunkers is planning to recreate your photograph, prove it could be faked." Philip slumped back in his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Peter and Jenny exchanged glances. "We fight back," Jenny said firmly. "We present the evidence, we stand by your story. Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Spencer, you need to be prepared. This is going to get harder before it gets easier." As Peter and Jenny outlined their plan to counter the skeptics' claims, Margaret watched her husband. She saw the determination in his eyes, but also the flicker of doubt, the weight of uncertainty. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Philip turned to Margaret. "Do you think I'm going mad, Maggie?" he asked, his voice small in the darkness. Margaret propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at her husband's troubled face. "No, Phil," she said softly. "I don't think you're mad. I think you experienced something extraordinary, something that's difficult for others to understand or accept." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But I do think we need to be careful. This quest for the truth, it can't come at the cost of everything else in our lives." Philip nodded slowly, reaching out to take her hand. "I know. I'm sorry, Maggie. I never meant for things to get so out of hand." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we face it as a team." As they drifted off to sleep, Philip's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts. He knew what he had seen, what he had experienced. The memories recovered during hypnosis felt as real as any others. But the doubts planted by the skeptics' attacks had taken root, growing like weeds in the garden of his certainty. What if he was wrong? What if his mind had somehow manufactured the entire experience? The implications were almost as terrifying as the apocalyptic visions he'd been shown. In the days that followed, Philip found himself scrutinizing every detail of his encounter, every recovered memory. He reached out to Alan Fitzgerald, asking for more analysis of the photograph. He spent hours on the phone with Peter and Jenny, going over his account again and again. The strain began to show. Margaret noticed the dark circles under Philip's eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. Their friends in Ilkley, once supportive, began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the controversy swirling around the Spencers. One afternoon, as Philip stood at the window, watching yet another news van pull up outside their house, he felt a moment of clarity cut through the fog of doubt and determination. "This has to stop," he said, turning to Margaret. "We need to step back, to regroup." Margaret looked up from her book, surprise and relief washing over her face. "What are you thinking, Phil?" Philip ran a hand through his hair, his expression resolute. "I'm thinking we need to get away for a while. Away from the media, away from the skeptics, somewhere we can clear our heads and decide what to do next." Margaret nodded slowly, a small smile playing at her lips. "Think that's a wonderful idea. Where should we go?" Philip thought for a moment, then smiled. "How about Scotland? We've always talked about visiting the Highlands." As they began to plan their getaway, Philip felt some of the tension of the past weeks begin to ease. He knew the questions, the doubts, quest for truth would still be waiting for them when they returned. But for now, he needed to step back, find solid ground again. The truth about what happened on Ilkley Moor was still out there, still calling to him. But Philip Spencer was beginning to realize that the journey to that truth might be longer and more complex than he had ever imagined. And if he was going to see it through, he would need to find a balance between his quest and the life he and Margaret had built together. As the sun set over Ilkley, casting long shadows across the moor where it had all begun, Philip and Margaret Spencer began to pack for their journey. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, their bond strengthened by the trials they had already endured. The truth was out there, but so was doubt, skepticism, and the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Navigating this new reality would require all of Philip's determination, all of Margaret's steadfast support, and a willingness to question not just the world around them, but their own beliefs and motivation. The road ahead was uncertain, but as Philip zipped up their suitcase, he felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever the truth might be, he was determined to find it. Not just for himself, but for all those who looked to the skies and wondered about humanity's place in the vast, mysterious universe. Chapter 9. The Ministry's Interest. The Scottish Highlands provided Philip and Margaret Spencer with a much-needed respite from the chaos that had engulfed their lives since the Ilkley Moor incident. The rugged landscapes and misty lochs offered a sense of peace and perspective that had been sorely lacking in recent weeks. As they sat in a small cafe in Inverness, watching the River Ness flow by, Philip felt more centered than he had in months. "You were right, Maggie," he said, reaching across the table to take his wife's hand. "We needed this." Margaret smiled, the worry lines that had become a permanent fixture on her face softening slightly. "I'm glad, Phil. It's good to see you relaxed again." Their moment of tranquility was interrupted by the chirping of Philip's mobile phone. He frowned, fishing it out of his pocket. They had told only a select few people how to reach them on this trip. "It's Peter Howe," Philip said, surprise evident in his voice. He answered the call, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "What is it?" Margaret asked as Philip ended the call, his face pale. "We need to go back," Philip said, his voice tight. "Something's happened." The drive back to Ilkley was tense, with Philip relaying what Peter had told him. Apparently, there had been inquiries about Philip's case from an unexpected source, the Ministry of Defence. "But I thought the MOD closed their UFO desk years ago," Margaret said, confusion evident in her voice. Philip nodded grimly. "They did, which makes their interest now all the more intriguing." As they pulled up to their house in Ilkley, they were greeted by an unusual sight. A sleek black car was parked in front of their home, and two men in dark suits stood on their doorstep. "Mr. and Mrs. Spencer?" one of the men called as they got out of their car. "We've been waiting for you." Philip approached cautiously, Margaret close behind him. "Who are you?" he asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. The taller of the two men produced an identification card. "I'm Agent Thompson, and this is my colleague, Agent Harris. We're from the Ministry of Defence. We'd like to have a word with you about your experience on Ilkley Moor." Philip and Margaret exchanged glances. This was unexpected, to say the least. "I thought the MOD wasn't interested in UFO sightings anymore," Philip said as they entered the house. Agent Thompson's face remained impassive. "Official policy and actual practice don't always align, Mr. Spencer. Your case has attracted significant attention, and not just from the public." Once they were settled in the living room, Agent Harris spoke for the first time. "Mr. Spencer, we need you to recount your experience in full detail. Leave nothing out, no matter how insignificant it might seem." For the next 2 hours, Philip went over his encounter once again, including the memories recovered during hypnosis. The agents listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but otherwise remaining silent. "And the photograph?" Agent Thompson asked when Philip had finished. "May we see it?" Philip hesitated, then nodded, retrieving the enhanced version from his study. As the agents examined it, he couldn't help but notice the look they exchanged. "Mr. Spencer," Agent Harris said finally, "are you aware that there have been other incidents in the area surrounding Ilkley Moor?" Philip leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Other incidents? You mean other UFO sightings?" Agent Thompson nodded slowly. "Among other things. There have been reports of unusual phenomena in the region for years. Your encounter is merely the most public." Margaret, who had been silent throughout most of the interview, spoke up. "Why are you telling us this? What do you want from Philip?" The agents exchanged another glance before Agent Thompson answered. "Mrs. Spencer, your husband's experience, combined with these other incidents, suggests that something significant is occurring in this area. We believe Mr. Spencer may be key to understanding what that is." Philip felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying? That this wasn't an isolated incident?" "We're saying, Mr. Spencer, that you may have stumbled into something much larger than a single close encounter," Agent Harris replied, "and we need your help to unravel it." As the implications of their words sank in, Philip felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. On one hand, this was validation, official recognition that his experience was part of something real and significant. On the other hand, the involvement of the Ministry of Defense added a new layer of complexity and potential danger to the situation. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Philip asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions inside him. Agent Thompson leaned forward, his expression intense. "We want you to work with us, Mr. Spencer, to help us investigate these phenomena. Your experience, your connection to whatever is happening here, it's invaluable." Margaret gripped Philip's hand tightly. "And if we refuse?" Agent Harris's voice was cold. "Mrs. Spencer, I'm not sure you understand the gravity of the situation. What your husband experienced, what's happening in this region, it could have implications for national security. Cooperation is not optional." The room fell silent as the weight of their words settled over everyone. Philip's mind raced with the possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. He had sought the truth about his encounter, but he had never imagined it would lead to this, to government involvement, to hints of a larger conspiracy. As he looked at Margaret, seeing the fear and concern in her eyes, Philip knew that whatever decision he made would change their lives irrevocably. The truth he had been seeking suddenly seemed more complex, more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "I need time to think," Philip said finally, his voice hoarse. "This is a lot to process." Agent Thompson nodded, standing up. "Of course, we'll be in touch soon, Mr. Spencer. But remember, discretion is paramount. What we've discussed here today goes no further." As the agents left, Philip and Margaret sat in stunned silence. The implications of what they had learned swirled around them like a gathering storm. The involvement of the Ministry of Defense, the hints of other incidents, the suggestion of a larger mystery centered around Ilkley Moor, was almost too much to comprehend. "What are we going to do, Phil?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Philip shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the point where the agent's car had disappeared down the street. "I don't know, Maggie, but I have a feeling our lives are about to change again, whether we want them to or not." As night fell over Ilkley, Philip Spencer stood at his window, looking out towards the moor where it had all begun. The truth he had been seeking now seemed more elusive than ever, shrouded in government secrecy and hints of a larger conspiracy. But one thing was certain, the encounter on Ilkley Moor was just the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths were waiting to be uncovered, Philip knew he had no choice but to see it through. The stakes, it seemed, were far higher than he had ever imagined. Chapter 10, A Link to the Past. The days following the visit from the Ministry of Defense agents were tense for Philip and Margaret Spencer. The weight of secrecy pressed down on them, straining their relationships with friends and family who couldn't understand their sudden reticence. Philip found himself torn between his desire to uncover the truth and his fear of the implications. The agent's words echoed in his mind, hinting at a mystery far larger and more complex than he had initially imagined. It was in this state of uncertainty, Philip received an unexpected call from Alan Fitzgerald, photo analysis expert who had first examined his alien photograph. "Mr. Spencer?" Alan's excited voice came through the phone. "I've made a fascinating discovery. I think you need to see this for yourself. Can you come to my office in Leeds?" Intrigued and grateful for a distraction from his current dilemma, Philip agreed. The next day, he and Margaret made the now familiar drive to Leeds. Alan's office was as cluttered as ever, but there was a palpable energy in the air as they entered. The young researcher was practically bouncing with excitement. "Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Spencer, thank you for coming," Alan said, ushering them to his computer. "I've been doing some additional analysis on your photograph, cross-referencing it with historical records and, well, look at this." He pulled up Philip's enhanced photo side by side with an old sepia-toned image. Philip leaned in, his eyes widening in surprise. The old photograph, clearly taken many decades ago, showed a group of men standing on what appeared to be Ilkley Moor. But in the background, partially obscured by mist, was a figure strikingly similar to the one in Philip's photo. "What is this?" Philip asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alan's grin widened. "This, Mr. Spencer, is a photograph taken in 1912 by a local historian named Edwin Blackwood. He was documenting the ancient stone circles on Ilkley Moor when he captured this anomaly." Margaret gasped. "But that's over 100 years ago. Are you saying that whatever Philip encountered has been visiting Ilkley Moor for at least a century?" "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying," Alan finished. Philip sat heavily in a nearby chair, his mind reeling. "Does anyone else know about this?" Alan shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to show you first. But Mr. Spencer, this could be groundbreaking. It suggests a long-term presence, a sustained interest in this specific location." As Philip stared at the two images, a thought struck him. This Edwin Blackwood, is he still alive? Alan shook his head. "No, he passed away in the 1950s. But," paused, typing rapidly on his keyboard, "it looks like he has a grandson still living in Ilkley. Dr. Edwin Blackwood Jr., a local historian like his grandfather." Philip and Margaret exchanged glances. "I think we need to pay Dr. Blackwood a visit," Philip said. The next day found them knocking on the door of a quaint cottage on the outskirts of Ilkley. Dr. Edwin Blackwood Jr. was a spry man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and keen blue eyes that lit up with interest when Philip explained the reason for their visit. "Grandfather's Ilkley Moor photographs? Oh my, I haven't looked at those in years," Dr. Blackwood said, leading them into a study crammed with books and artifacts. "But I remember them well. Grandfather was quite obsessed with the moor and its mystery." As Dr. Blackwood rummaged through an old filing cabinet, Philip took in the room. It was a treasure trove of local history, with maps, photographs, and artifacts covering every available surface. "Ah, here we are," Dr. Blackwood said, pulling out a dusty album. As he laid it on his desk, Philip and Margaret crowded around, their hearts racing. Dr. Blackwood flipped through the pages, each filled with meticulously labeled photographs of Ilkley Moor. And then, there it was, the photo Alan had shown them, but in its original context, surrounded by notes in spidery handwriting. "Grandfather called this his visitor photograph," Dr. Blackwood explained. "He was convinced he'd captured something extraordinary that day. Of course, most people dismissed it as a trick of the light or a double exposure." Philip leaned in, studying the old man's notes. "Did your grandfather ever see anything else unusual on the moor?" Dr. Blackwood's eyes twinkled. "Oh, grandfather had many stories. Lights in the sky, strange sounds, areas where compasses wouldn't work properly. He believed the moor was a special place, a nexus of some kind." As Dr. Blackwood continued to share his grandfather's tales, Philip felt a growing sense of excitement and trepidation. Each story seemed to add another piece to a puzzle he hadn't even known existed a few months ago. "Dr. Blackwood," Philip said finally, "I need to tell you something. Something that I think connects directly to your grandfather's experiences." Over the next hour, Philip shared his own encounter on Ilkley Moor, showing Dr. Blackwood his photograph and explaining the recent interest from the Ministry of Defense. The old historian listened with rapt attention, occasionally nodding as if pieces of a long-pondered puzzle were finally falling into place. "Mr. Spencer," Dr. Blackwood said when Philip had finished, "I believe you've experienced something that my grandfather spent his whole life trying to understand. Ilkley Moor has always been a place of mystery, connection between our world and something else." He stood, moving to a large map of Ilkley Moor pinned to one wall. "Look here," he said, pointing to various marked locations. "Stone circles, cup and ring marks, areas of reported phenomena. They form a pattern, Mr. Spencer, a pattern that your encounter fits into perfectly." As Philip studied the map, he felt a chill run down his spine. The implications were staggering. His encounter wasn't just a random event. It was part of something larger, something that had been ongoing for centuries. "But what does it mean?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why here? Why Ilkley Moor?" Dr. Blackwood shook his head slowly. "That, Mrs. Spencer, is the question my grandfather spent his life trying to answer, and I believe it's the question at the heart of whatever is happening here." As they left Dr. Blackwood's cottage, Philip's mind was awhirl with new information and possibilities. Connection to the past, the suggestion of a larger pattern, it all pointed to something far more significant than a single close encounter. "What are you thinking, Phil?" Margaret asked as they drove home. Philip was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I'm thinking," he said finally, "that we've only scratched the surface of this mystery. And I'm thinking that maybe working with the Ministry of Defense isn't such a bad idea after all." As Ilkley Moor loomed in the distance, shrouded in its ever-present mist, Philip Spencer felt a renewed sense of purpose. The truth he sought was out there, hidden in the ancient stones and misty hollows of the moor. And now, with links to the past and hints of a larger pattern, he was more determined than ever to uncover it. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers or revelations awaited, Philip knew one thing for certain: the mystery of Ilkley Moor was far from over. In fact, it seemed that his journey into the unknown was only just beginning. Chapter 11. The Debunker. As Philip Spencer delved deeper into the mysteries surrounding Ilkley Moor, public interest in his story showed no signs of waning. While many were captivated by the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, others viewed Philip's claims with intense skepticism. Among the most vocal of these skeptics was Thomas Watterson, a local science teacher who had taken it upon himself to debunk Philip's account. Watterson had become a fixture on local news programs, offering alternative explanations for Philip's experience and the photograph. His rational approach and articulate arguments had gained him a following, and he had become something of a thorn in Philip's side. It was a crisp autumn morning when Philip received a call from Sarah Thompson, the journalist who had first reported his story. "Mr. Spencer," Sarah's voice crackled through the phone, "I'm organizing a public debate on your Ilkley Moor encounter. Thomas Watterson has agreed to participate. Would you be willing to defend your account in a public forum?" Philip hesitated. He had avoided direct confrontation with the skeptics thus far, but he knew he couldn't hide forever. After a moment's consideration, he agreed. The debate was scheduled for the following week at the Ilkley Playhouse. As Philip and Margaret arrived, they were greeted by a crowd of curious onlookers and journalists. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Inside, the small theater was packed. Philip took his place on the stage, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. Across from him sat Thomas Watterson, a man in his early 40s with sharp features and piercing green eyes. Sarah Thompson, acting as moderator, opened the debate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to discuss one of the most controversial events in recent local history, the alleged UFO encounter on Ilkley Moor. Mr. Spencer, would you please begin by recounting your experience?" Philip took a deep breath and began his now familiar account. As he spoke, he could see Watterson scribbling notes, his eyes narrowed in concentration. When Philip finished, Watterson leaned forward. "Mr. Spencer," he began, his voice calm and measured, "while I don't doubt that you believe what you're saying, I must challenge the extraterrestrial explanation for your experience." Watterson stood, addressing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Mr. Spencer experienced that morning was not an alien encounter, but a combination of natural phenomena and psychological factors." He turned back to Philip. "Mr. Spencer, you mentioned that the morning was particularly foggy. Are you aware of a phenomenon called fog ghosts?" Philip shook his head, and Watterson continued. "Fog ghosts are optical illusions created when fog droplets scatter light in unusual ways. They can create the appearance of strange, even humanoid shapes." "The photograph," Philip began, only to be cut off by Watterson. "Ah, yes. Photograph," Watterson said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "Mr. Spencer, are you familiar with pareidolia?" When Philip again shook his head, Watterson explained. "Pareidolia is the tendency for the human mind to see patterns or familiar shapes where none exist. It's why we see faces in clouds or on the surface of Mars. Your photograph, which I've examined extensively, shows nothing more than an indistinct shape in the fog. A shape that your mind, primed by the strange experience you just had, interpreted as an alien being. Philip felt his frustration rising. But what about the missing time? Malfunctioning equipment? Watterson nodded, as if he'd been expecting this question. Temporal disorientation is not uncommon in stressful or unusual situations. As for the equipment malfunctions, Ilkley Moor is known for its unusual magnetic properties. They've been causing compasses to behave erratically for centuries. As Watterson continued to offer rational explanations for every aspect of Philip's encounter, Philip felt his certainty begin to waver. Could it be possible? Could his mind have somehow manufactured the entire experience? From the audience, Margaret watched with growing concern. She could see the doubt creeping into her husband's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as Watterson dismantled his account piece by piece. When it was Philip's turn to respond, he found himself struggling to articulate the profound nature of his experience in the face of Watterson's logical arguments. "I know what I saw," Philip insisted, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "It was real. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination." Watterson's response was sympathetic but firm. "Mr. Spencer, I don't doubt the sincerity of your belief. But the human mind is a powerful thing, capable of creating vivid experiences that feel entirely real. Isn't it more likely that you experienced a series of natural phenomena that your mind interpreted in an extraordinary way, rather than an encounter with extraterrestrial beings?" As the debate continued, Philip found himself on the defensive, struggling to counter Watterson's well-researched arguments. By the time Sarah Thompson called for closing statements, Philip felt drained and disheartened. In the car ride home, Margaret tried to comfort her husband. "You did well, Phil. You stood your ground." Philip shook his head, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Did I?" Watterson had an explanation for everything, Maggie. What if he's right? What if it was all in my head?" Margaret reached out, squeezing his arm. "Phil, I've known you for over 30 years. You're not the type to imagine things, and you're certainly not crazy. Whatever happened that morning was real, even if we don't fully understand it." As they arrived home, Philip was surprised to see a familiar black car parked outside their house. Agent Thompson from the Ministry of Defense stood by the front door, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Spencer," he said as Philip approached. "We need to talk. Recent developments have made your cooperation urgent." Philip exchanged a glance with Margaret, feeling a mix of trepidation and curiosity. Despite the doubts sown by Watterson's arguments, the government's continued interest suggested that there was more to his experience than mere tricks of light and imagination. As they entered the house, Philip realized that his journey into the unknown was far from over. The debate with Watterson had shaken his confidence, but it had also strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. The mystery of Ilkley Moor still beckoned, its secrets hidden in the mist and stone. And Philip Spencer, despite his doubts and fears, was determined to see it through to the end. Chapter 12. Echoes of Encounters. The presence of Agent Thompson on their doorstep had reignited Philip's curiosity, momentarily pushing aside the doubts sown by Thomas Watterson's debunking effort. As they settled in the living room, the agent's typically stoic demeanor seemed strained, hinting at the urgency of the situation. "Mr. Spencer," Agent Thompson began, his voice low and measured, "we've uncovered new information that puts your experience in a broader context. You're not alone in what you've witnessed." Philip leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" Thompson pulled out a file from his briefcase. "Over the past few decades, there have been numerous reports of encounters similar to yours, all centered around Ilkley Moor and the surrounding areas." He spread several photographs on the coffee table. Each showed blurry images reminiscent of Philip's own photograph, indistinct shapes that hinted at something not quite human. "This one," Thompson said, pointing to a particular image, "was taken in 1980 in Todmorden, just a few miles from here." Philip's eyes widened in recognition. "The Alan Godfrey incident? I've read about that." Thompson nodded. "Godfrey's experience shares several similarities with yours. Missing time, a close encounter with an unexplained being, and subsequent ridicule and skepticism. Margaret, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. But if there have been so many incidents, why isn't this common knowledge? The agent's expression tightened. That, Mrs. Spencer, is part of why I'm here. There are elements within the government that believe this information should remain classified. Philip felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying there's been a cover-up? Not exactly, Thompson replied carefully. More of a containment strategy. But recent events, including your public exposure, have made that strategy increasingly untenable. He turned to face Philip directly. Mr. Spencer, we need your help. Your experience, combined with your public profile, puts you in a unique position to assist our investigation. Philip sat back, his mind reeling. The implications of what Thompson was saying were enormous. What exactly are you asking me to do? We want you to work with us, Mr. Spencer, to help us connect the dots between these incidents. Your familiarity with the area and your first-hand experience make you invaluable to our efforts. As Philip considered the offer, Margaret interjected. And what about the risks? The media circus, the skeptics like Watterson. How do we know this won't make things worse? Thompson's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Spencer, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, we're equipped to provide protection and support. This is bigger than just one incident or one family. The truth about what's happening here could have far-reaching implications. Philip stood, walking to the window that overlooked Ilkley Moor in the distance. Familiar landscape now seemed charged with mystery. Each shadow and misty hollow potentially hiding secrets beyond imagination. If I agree to this, Philip said slowly, I want full access to all the information you have. No more half-truths or need-to-know basis. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Thompson nodded. Agreed, but you must understand, Mr. Spencer, that once you're in, there's no going back. The things you'll learn, they may change your perception of reality forever. Philip turned back to face the room, his expression resolute. I think that ship has already sailed, Agent Thompson. Ever since that morning on the moor, nothing has been the same. If there's a chance to understand why, to uncover the truth behind these encounters, then I have to take it. Margaret stood, moving to Philip's side and taking his hand. We have to take it, she corrected, her voice firm. Whatever happens, we face it together. Thompson allowed himself a small smile. Very well, we'll begin tomorrow. I'll have a car pick you up at 0800 hours. Pack for a few days, we're going to revisit some of the sites of previous encounters. As the agent left, Philip and Margaret stood in silence, the weight of their decisions settling over them. The quiet was broken by the shrill ring of the telephone. Philip answered, surprised to hear Peter Ho's excited voice on the other end. Philip, thank God I've reached you. Something's happened. Something big. Slow down, Peter, Philip said, putting the call on speaker. What's going on? There's been another sighting, Peter said, his words tumbling out in a rush. Last night on Ilkley Moor. Multiple witnesses, photographs, even video footage. It's all over social media. Philip and Margaret exchanged stunned glances. Are you sure it's credible? Philip asked. As sure as we can be at this point. Jenny and I are heading up there now to interview witnesses. Philip, this is huge. Corroborates your experience, and it's happening right in your backyard. As Philip hung up the phone, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions, excitement, vindication, but also a deep unease. The echoes of past encounters were growing louder, converging on the present in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. What do we do now? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Philip took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. We pack, and then we get ready to face whatever comes next. Truth is out there, Maggie, hidden in the mists of Ilkley Moor, and we're going to find it. As night fell over Ilkley, Philip and Margaret Spencer prepared for a journey into the unknown. The mysteries that had begun with one man's encounter on a misty morning were expanding, drawing in decades of hidden history and hinting at revelations yet to come. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths or dangers awaited in the shadow of Ilkley Moor, Philip knew that the next few days would change everything. The echoes of past encounters were converging, and he was at the center of the storm. Chapter 13. The Young Enthusiast. Following morning dawned gray and misty, a fitting atmosphere for the journey that lay ahead. As Philip and Margaret prepared to leave with Agent Thompson, their quiet street was suddenly disrupted by the arrival of a sleek motorcycle. The rider, clad in a leather jacket adorned with UFO patches, pulled up in front of their house and removed her helmet, revealing a young woman with vibrant blue hair. "Mr. Spencer," she called out, her eyes alight with excitement. "I'm Samantha Chen. I run the blog Cosmic Connections. I was hoping I could talk to you about last night's sighting." Philip exchanged a wary glance with Margaret and Agent Thompson. The agent's expression hardened, clearly unhappy with this unexpected interruption. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen," Philip began, "but we're actually just leaving." "Oh, where are you going?" Samantha interrupted, her enthusiasm undimmed. "Is it about the new sighting? I've got some amazing footage from last night. Look." Before anyone could stop her, Samantha had pulled out a tablet and was rapidly pulling up videos and images. Despite himself, Philip found his attention drawn to the screen. Footage, though shaky, clearly showed strange lights moving in impossible patterns over Ilkley Moor. "Miss Chen," Agent Thompson stepped forward, his voice stern, "I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. This is a private matter." Samantha's eyes narrowed as she took in Thompson's appearance. "Who are you? Are you with the government? Oh my God, is this a cover-up?" Philip, seeing the situation spiraling, made a quick decision. "Samantha, why don't you come with us? We're actually heading to investigate these sightings, and your footage could be useful." "Philip," Margaret hissed, while Thompson looked thunderous. "Mr. Spencer, I must object." The agent began, but Philip cut him off. "Agent Thompson, you said you wanted my help. Well, Samantha here has valuable information and a fresh perspective. We're really trying to get to the bottom of this. We need all the help we can get." There was a tense moment as Thompson considered this, his jaw clenched. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine. But Miss Chen, you'll need to sign some non-disclosure agreement, and that footage stays with us." Samantha's face lit up with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Non-disclosure agreements? Mysterious government agents? This is even bigger than I thought. As they all piled into Thompson's government-issue SUV, with Samantha following on her motorcycle, Philip couldn't help but feel that the dynamic of their investigation had just shifted dramatically. The drive to their first destination, the site of Alan Godfrey's 1980 encounter in Todmorden, was filled with an odd mix of tension and excited chatter. Samantha, undeterred by Thompson's frosty demeanor, peppered them with questions and theories. "So, Mr. Spencer," he said, her eyes shining with curiosity, "do you think these beings are extraterrestrial, or could they be interdimensional? I've been researching quantum theories that suggest—" "Miss Chen," Thompson interrupted, patience clearly wearing thin, "perhaps we could focus on the facts rather than speculation." Samantha wasn't easily deterred. "But isn't speculation necessary when dealing with the unknown? We need to consider all possibilities." Philip found himself both amused and impressed by the young woman's enthusiasm. Her questions, while sometimes far-fetched, were also insightful, approaching the mystery from angles he hadn't considered. As they arrived in Todmorden, Philip felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Quiet streets and misty hills were eerily reminiscent of Ilkley. Thompson guided them to a nondescript stretch of road on the outskirts of town. "This is where Police Constable Alan Godfrey encountered what he described as a diamond-shaped UFO in November 1980, Thompson explained. "Like you, Mr. Spencer, he experienced missing time and later underwent hypnotic regression." As they examined the area, Samantha busied herself with an array of equipment she'd brought along, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and other devices Philip couldn't identify. "I'm picking up some unusual electromagnetic readings," she announced, frowning at one of her devices. "They're similar to patterns I've detected on Ilkley Moor." Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Samantha's preparedness. "You've been conducting your own investigations on the moor?" Samantha nodded enthusiastically. "For months now, I've been tracking anomalies, correlating them with sighting reports and historical data." Philip watched as Thompson's attitude towards Samantha subtly shifted. The agent's initial dismissiveness was giving way to a grudging respect for her dedication and knowledge. As they continued their investigation, comparing notes on the Godfrey incident with Philip's experience, Samantha's tech-savvy approach began to yield interesting results. Her analysis of the electromagnetic anomalies suggested a pattern that seemed to link various sighting locations. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a map on her tablet. "If we overlay the EMF hotspots with reported sighting locations over the past few decades, a clear pattern emerges. It's almost like a circuit board." Philip leaned in, fascinated. The implications were staggering. Could these anomalies be deliberate? Form of alien technology embedded in the landscape itself? As the day wore on, they visited several more locations linked to historical UFO sightings. At each site, Samantha's equipment detected similar electromagnetic anomalies, strengthening the theory of a connected pattern. By the time they returned to Ilkley that evening, Philip's mind was reeling with new information and possibilities. Samantha's fresh perspective and technological approach had opened up new avenues of investigation that he'd never considered. As they parted ways, with plans to reconvene the next day, Philip turned to Samantha. "Thank you for your help today. Your insights have been invaluable." Samantha beamed. "Thank you for giving me a chance, Mr. Spencer. This is the opportunity of a lifetime for me." As Philip watched her ride away on her motorcycle, he turned to Agent Thompson. "Well, what do you think?" Thompson's expression was thoughtful. "I think, Mr. Spencer, that we may have underestimated the value of alternative investigative methods. Miss Chen's approach, while unorthodox, has provided us with new leads to pursue." That night, as Philip and Margaret prepared for bed, they discussed the day's events. "It's all connected, Maggie," Philip said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "These encounters, the electromagnetic anomalies, the patterns in the landscape, all part of something bigger than we ever imagined." Margaret squeezed his hand, "And we're right in the middle of it all. Oh, Phil, where do you think this is leading us?" Philip gazed out the window towards Ilkley Moor, shrouded in its ever-present mist. "I don't know, love, but I have a feeling we're on the verge of uncovering something that could change everything. The truth is out there, hidden in the patterns and anomalies, and with Samantha's help, we might just have a chance of finding it." As they drifted off to sleep, Philip's dreams were filled with strange lights and hidden patterns, echoing across time and space. The mystery of Ilkley Moor was deepening, and with each new discovery, the stakes seemed to grow higher. Whatever revelations lay ahead, Philip knew that their journey into the unknown was far from over. Fact, felt like it was only just beginning. Chapter 14, Official Denial. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Philip Spencer and his unlikely team of investigators. Samantha's technological expertise, combined with Agent Thompson's access to classified information and Philip's first-hand experience, had led to a series of startling discoveries. The pattern of electromagnetic anomalies they had uncovered seemed to suggest a vast, hidden network centered around Ilkley Moor and stretching across Yorkshire. As they delved deeper into their investigation, Philip couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of a major breakthrough. However, their progress was about to face an unexpected obstacle. It was early morning when Philip's phone rang, jolting him awake. On the other end was a frantic Peter Ho. "Philip, turn on the news. Now." Confused and still groggy, Philip fumbled for the remote and switched on the television. What he saw made his blood run cold. A stern-faced government official was addressing a press conference. The caption at the bottom of the screen identified him as James Hartley, a senior spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense. "Want to make it absolutely clear that the Ministry of Defense has no interest in so-called UFO investigations," Lee was saying. "The UFO desk was closed years ago. And for good reason. These alleged sightings are nothing more than misidentified natural phenomena or hoaxes." Philip sat up straighter, his heart racing. This was a direct contradiction of everything Agent Thompson had told them. Hartley continued, his voice dripping with dismissive authority. "Furthermore, we want to address the recent claims made by Philip Spencer regarding his alleged encounter on Ilkley Moor. The ministry has thoroughly investigated these claims and found them to be without merit. Mr. Spencer's experience, while no doubt distressing for him, has a perfectly rational explanation involving weather conditions and possible hallucinatory effects of local flora." Margaret, who had joined Philip on the couch, gasped. "They're discrediting you, Phil. But why? after everything Thompson has told us. Before Philip could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Agent Thompson. Stay where you are. Do not speak to anyone. I'm on my way. The next few hours were tense. Philip and Margaret waited anxiously, fielding a barrage of calls from journalists seeking comment on the ministry's statement. Peter Howe and Jenny Randalls called, offering their support and expressing their shock at the official denial. When Agent Thompson finally arrived, his usual composed demeanor was noticeably strained. He entered the house quickly, checking to make sure he hadn't been followed. Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Spencer, I owe you an explanation, he began, voice low and urgent. The statement this morning, it wasn't supposed to happen. There's a faction within the ministry that wants to shut down our investigation. Philip felt a surge of anger. So everything you've told us, everything we've discovered, it's all being swept under the rug? Thompson shook his head. Not if I can help it, but we need to be careful. Very careful. The official denial has raised the stake. We're going to continue. We need to operate in complete secrecy. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Everyone froze. Thompson motioned for silence as he cautiously approached the entrance, one hand inside his jacket, where Philip assumed he kept a weapon. When he opened the door, it wasn't government agents or reporters standing there. It was Samantha Chen, her face pale and her usual enthusiasm replaced by a look of determination. They're trying to shut us down, she said without preamble. But I've got something they can't ignore. Samantha brushed past Thompson and set up her laptop on the coffee table. Last night, I was running some deep analysis on the electromagnetic data we've collected. I noticed a pattern in the frequencies, something that couldn't be natural. So I ran it through a decryption algorithm and... She hit a key, and suddenly the room was filled with a series of strange rhythmic sounds. It was like nothing Philip had ever heard before. Complex, almost musical series of tones and pulses. What is that? Margaret asked, her voice hushed. Samantha's eyes were shining with excitement. I think it's a message, embedded in the electromagnetic anomalies we've been tracking. And it's not random, there's a clear pattern, a structure to it. Agent Thompson leaned in, his professional facade cracking to reveal genuine awe. Are you saying we've intercepted an alien communication? I don't know if it's alien, Samantha replied. But it's definitely not natural and it's definitely not human. Whatever's causing these anomalies, whatever's behind the sightings, it's trying to communicate. The implications hit Philip like a physical blow. This wasn't just about his encounter anymore. This was evidence of an ongoing, deliberate attempt at communication from an unknown intelligence. We need to decode this message, Philip said, his voice filled with newfound determination. And we need to do it before the ministry succeeds in shutting us down. Agent Thompson nodded grimly. I have some contacts. Cryptographers, linguists, people who can be trusted. But we'll need to move fast and stay under the radar. As they began to formulate a plan, Philip couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. They were on the verge of a discovery that could change the course of human history. But with the ministry actively working against them, the path ahead was fraught with danger. Looking around at his unlikely team, a government agent going rogue, a tech-savvy UFO blogger, and his steadfast wife, Philip realized that the fate, this earth-shattering discovery, now rested in their hands. As night fell over Ilkley, the moor shrouded in mist as always, Philip Spencer stood at his window, contemplating the enormity of what lay ahead. The mystery that had begun with his solitary encounter had grown into something far larger, far more profound than he could have ever imagined. Whatever the coded message contained, whatever truths it might reveal about humanity's place in the universe, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again, and Philip was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The truth was calling out from the stars, echoing through the ancient stones of Ilkley Moor. And Philip Spencer was ready to answer. Chapter 15. A New Sighting. The days following the discovery of the encrypted message were a blur of furtive meetings and late-night decoding sessions. Philip, Samantha, and Agent Thompson had set up a makeshift command center in Philip's study, away from prying eyes and potential surveillance. Margaret had taken on the role of lookout and liaison, fielding inquiries from increasingly persistent journalists and maintaining a facade of normalcy to the outside world. The pressure was mounting, and Philip could see the strain in her eyes each time she brought them cups of strong coffee to fuel their work. It was on the third night of their clandestine operation that everything changed once again. Quiet of the early morning hours was shattered by the shrill ringing of Philip's phone. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Spencer?" A woman's voice, tense and official. "This is Detective Inspector Alison Foster, from the West Yorkshire Police. There's been an incident on Ilkley Moor. We need you to come in." Philip's heart raced. "What kind of incident?" "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, sir. Please, it's urgent." After a hurried conference with Thompson and Samantha, Philip agreed to meet the detective. As he prepared to leave, Margaret caught his arm. "Be careful, Phil," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something doesn't feel right about this." Philip nodded, squeezing her hand reassuringly before heading out into the pre-dawn darkness. The police station was a hive of activity despite the early hour. Detective Inspector Foster, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s, ushered Philip into a small interview room. "Mr. Spencer, thank you for coming," she began, her tone businesslike. "At approximately 2:30 this morning, we received multiple reports of unusual activity on Ilkley Moor. Lights in the sky, strange sounds, and—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "A sighting of what witnesses described as a non-human entity." Philip leaned forward, his fatigue forgotten. "Similar to what I saw?" Foster nodded grimly. "Very similar, Mr. Spencer. But this time, we have more than just eyewitness accounts. One of the witnesses managed to capture video footage." She turned to a laptop on the table and hit play. The video was shaky, clearly taken on a smartphone, but what it showed made Philip's breath catch in his throat. There, illuminated by what seemed to be its own faint glow, was a figure eerily reminiscent of the being Philip had encountered. Small, with a large head and spindly limbs, moved with an otherworldly grace across the misty moor. "My God," Philip breathed. "It's real. It's all real." Foster paused the video, turning to face Philip with an intense gaze. "Mr. Spencer, I'll be frank. I've been skeptical of your claims, of all the UFO nonsense that's been circulating. But this I can't explain away. I need your help to understand what we're dealing with here." For the next hour, Philip recounted his experience in detail, answering Foster's probing questions and providing context for the new sighting. As they talked, he could see the detective's worldview shifting, her skepticism giving way to a wary acceptance of the inexplicable. "There's something else," Foster said finally, her voice low. "After the sighting, our officers found something at the site. Something not from around here." She produced a small evidence bag. Inside was a metallic object about the size of a coin, covered in intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change as Philip looked at them. "We need to get this to Samantha," Philip said urgently. "And Agent Thompson. They need to see this." Foster's eyebrows shot up. "Agent Thompson? From the Ministry of Defense? Mr. Spencer, what exactly have you gotten yourself involved in?" Before Philip could respond, a commotion erupted outside the interview room. The door burst open, revealing a flustered officer. "Ma'am, you need to see this," said breathlessly. "It's all over the news." They rushed to the station's common area, where a small crowd had gathered around a television. On the screen, amateur footage showed multiple points of light moving in impossible patterns over Ilkley Moor. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen screamed, "Mass UFO sighting over Yorkshire. Government denials crumble." Philip's phone buzzed with a text from Samantha. "It's happening. A message we decoded. It was a warning. They're coming." As the implications of Samantha's message sank in, Philip realized that the situation had escalated beyond anything they could have anticipated. Carefully maintained veil of secrecy was being torn apart, not by their investigations, but by events beyond their control. Detective Inspector Foster turned to Philip, her expression a mixed determination and barely concealed fear. "Mr. Spencer, I think it's time you told me everything you know. Whatever's happening, it's clear we're going to need all the help we can get." As dawn broke over Ilkley, bathing the moor in an ethereal light, Philip Spencer found himself at the center of a storm that was about to break wide open. The truth he had sought was revealing itself in ways he could never have imagined, and the consequences were going to be felt far beyond the misty hills of Yorkshire. The veil between worlds was thinning, and whatever lay on the other side was making its presence known. As Philip left the police station, his mind racing with the implications of the night's events, he knew that the real challenge was only just beginning. The truth was out there, no longer hiding in the shadows but boldly announcing its presence to the world. And Philip Spencer, once a skeptic, now stood as one of the few people prepared to face whatever was coming. Chapter 16: The American Perspective. The days following the mass sighting over Ilkley Moor were a whirlwind of activity. The story had gone global, with news outlets from around the world descending on the quiet Yorkshire town. Amid the chaos, Philip Spencer found himself thrust into the spotlight as the man whose original encounter had foreshadowed these extraordinary events. It was in this tumultuous atmosphere that Maria Gonzalez arrived in Ilkley. A seasoned investigative journalist from the United States, Maria had made a name for herself covering controversial topics, including alleged government cover-ups of UFO incidents. Philip first met Maria at a hastily arranged press conference outside the Ilkley police station. As he fielded questions from the swarm of reporters, her piercing gaze and incisive queries stood out. "Mr. Spencer," Maria called out, accent distinctly American, "how do you respond to claims that these events bear striking similarities to incidents reported in the southwestern United States, particularly the Phoenix Lights of 1997? Philip hesitated, caught off guard by the comparison. I'm not familiar with the details of that incident," he admitted. Maria pressed on. "Both cases involved mass sightings, multiple witnesses, and alleged government denial. Do you believe there's a connection?" Before Philip could respond, Agent Thompson stepped in, smoothly deflecting further questions and ending the press conference. As the crowd dispersed, Maria approached Philip directly. "Mr. Spencer, I'm Maria Gonzalez from the New York Times," she said, extending her hand. "I'd like to talk to you more about your experiences, if you're willing. I think there might be more to this story than just what's happening in Ilkley." Despite Thompson's visible disapproval, Philip agreed to meet with Maria later that day. Her perspective as an outsider with extensive knowledge of UFO phenomena in the United States could prove valuable. That evening, Philip, Margaret, Samantha, and Agent Thompson gathered in the Spencers' living room to hear what Maria had to say. The atmosphere was tense, with Thompson clearly uncomfortable about bringing an American journalist into their confidential discussions. Maria, however, wasted no time in laying out her case. She pulled out a laptop and began presenting a series of photographs, videos, and documents. "What's happening here in Ilkley isn't an isolated incident," she began. "It's part of a pattern that's been building for decades, possibly centuries, across the globe. But there are striking similarities to cases we've seen in the U.S. She showed them footage of the Phoenix Lights, a mass UFO sighting that occurred in 1997 over Arizona. The similarities to what had been seen over Ilkley Moor, undeniable. And it's not just Phoenix," Maria continued. "Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction case in 1961. Rendlesham Forest incident right here in the UK in 1980. They all share common elements: unexplained craft, encounters with non-human entities, missing time, and subsequent government denials." As Maria spoke, Philip felt a growing sense of both excitement and trepidation. The scope of what they were dealing with was far larger than he had imagined. "But here's where it gets really interesting," Maria said, leaning forward intently. "In recent years, there's been a shift in how the U.S. government is approaching this phenomenon. In 2017, the New York Times broke the story of a secret Pentagon program called AAIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It was tasked with investigating UFO sighting. Agent Thompson stirred uncomfortably. "Ms. Gonzalez, I'm not sure how much credence we can give to." Maria cut him off. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment on unidentified aerial phenomena. It admitted that there are objects in our skies that defy conventional explanation. The U.S. government is taking this seriously, even if they won't admit it publicly. Samantha, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. How does this relate to what we've discovered here? The electromagnetic anomalies, the encoded message? Maria's eyes lit up. That's where your work becomes crucial. Patterns you've uncovered here in Yorkshire, I believe they're part of a larger global network. We could correlate your data with information from other hotspots around the world. We might be able to see the big picture. Philip finished, his mind racing with the possibilities. For the next few hours, they pored over Maria's research, comparing notes and looking for connections. The journalist's global perspective added a new dimension to their understanding, placing the Ilkley incidents within a broader context of worldwide phenomena. As the night wore on, a new theory began to emerge. The events in Ilkley, sightings in the US, global patterns of activity, they all seemed to be building towards something. It's like they're preparing us, Margaret said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. All these incidents, spread out over years and across the globe, what if it's all been leading up to some kind of disclosure? The room fell silent as they contemplated the implications. Margaret was right. If all of this was indeed preparation for a larger revelation, then what they did next could have profound implications for all of humanity. As dawn broke over Ilkley Moor, casting long shadows across the ancient landscape, Philip Spencer stood at his window, lost in thought. The mystery that had begun with his solitary encounter had expanded far beyond anything he could have imagined, encompassing global phenomena and possibly the fate of human civilization itself. He turned to face the room, where his unlikely team of investigators, a rogue government agent, a tech-savvy blogger, an American journalist, and his steadfast wife, waited expectantly. We need to go public, Philip said, his voice firm with resolve. Not just with what's happened here in Ilkley, but with everything we've pieced together. The world needs to know what's coming. As the others nodded in agreement, Philip felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Whatever was coming, whatever revelations or challenges lay ahead, they would face it together. And they would make sure the world was ready. The truth was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was emerging into the light, and Philip Spencer was determined to be there when it did, ready to bridge the gap between two worlds. Chapter 17. Return to the Moor. The decision to go public with their findings was not taken lightly. For days, Philip and his team debated the best approach, weighing the potential consequences against the urgency of their message. In the end, it was agreed that before they could present their case to the world, they needed one final piece of evidence, something so compelling that it couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And so, on a chilly autumn morning, Philip Spencer found himself once again walking the misty paths of Ilkley Moor, the site where his extraordinary journey had begun. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Samantha Chen, her array of high-tech equipment in tow, walked beside him. Agent Thompson followed a few paces behind, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Maria Gonzalez completed their group, her journalist's notebook at the ready. Margaret had stayed behind to coordinate with Peter Ho and Jenny Randalls, preparing for the media storm that would surely follow their announcement. As they approached the spot where Philip had first encountered the alien being, palpable tension fell over the group. The moor seemed different somehow, charged with an energy that set their nerves on edge. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts, Samantha murmured, frowning at her instrument. It's like the whole area is vibrating. Philip nodded, feeling a familiar tingle at the base of his skull. It's just like that morning. The air, the light, it's all the same. They spread out, each focusing on their assigned tasks. Samantha set up her equipment, attempting to capture and analyze the strange energy permeating the area. Agent Thompson began a methodical search of the ground, looking for any physical evidence they might have missed in previous investigations. Maria interviewed Philip on camera, recording his impressions as they revisited the site of his encounter. As the morning wore on, their search seemed to be in vain. The moor kept its secrets, revealing nothing new despite their best effort. Frustration began to set in, the weight of their self-imposed deadline pressing down on them. It was then, in a moment of quiet desperation, that Philip decided to try something different. Moving away from the others, he found a quiet spot and simply stood, closing his eyes and opening his mind to the moor as he had that fateful morning. For long moments, nothing happened. Then, slowly, he became aware of a change in the air around him. A low hum, just at the edge of hearing, began to build. Philip opened his eyes to find the mist swirling around him in unnatural patterns. "Everyone," he calls, voice tight with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Something's happening." The others rushed to his side, their expressions a mix of awe and trepidation as they witnessed the strange phenomenon. The swirling mist began to coalesce, forming shapes that seemed almost but not quite solid. Samantha's equipment crackled with energy. It's like the fabric of reality is thinning," breathed, her eyes wide as she studied the readings, the barrier between our world and something else. As they watched, transfixed, the mist shapes became more defined. And there, emerging from the swirling vapors, was a figure hauntingly familiar to Philip. The alien being he had encountered all those months ago. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, partially obscured by the mist, loomed the unmistakable outline of a craft, surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. Maria's camera whirred as she captured the unbelievable scene. Agent Thompson stood frozen, his usual composure shattered by the reality of what they were witnessing. The alien being raised a hand, just as it had in Philip's first encounter. But now, instead of a gesture of warning or greeting, it seemed to be beckoning, inviting. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Philip took a step forward. He could hear the others calling out to him, their voices distant and muffled as if coming from underwater. But his focus was entirely on the being before him, on the answers it might provide. As he approached, the air around him seemed to shimmer and distort. The moor faded away, replaced by a kaleidoscope of images and sensations. Philip saw flashes of other worlds, of civilizations rising and falling, of the vast expanse of the cosmos itself. And through it all, a message began to form in his mind. Not in words, but in concepts and emotions that transcended language. He understood, with a clarity that shook him to his core, that this was not just a visitation, it was an invitation. Call to humanity to take its place in a larger cosmic community. The visions lasted only moments, but to Philip, felt like a lifetime. As the moor slowly came back into focus around him, he became aware of his teammates gathered close, their faces etched with concern and wonder. "Phil? Phil, are you all right?" Samantha's voice broke through the fog in his mind. Philip blinked, trying to process the enormity of what he had just experienced. I saw," began, but words failed him. "We all saw it, Philip," Maria said softly, her camera still trained on the spot where the being had stood. "It was real. All of it." Agent Thompson, his face pale, nodded in agreement. "I've spent my career dealing in secrets and denials. But this changes everything." As the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in, Philip felt a surge of purpose. They had come seeking evidence, and they had received so much more. They had been given a message, a vision of humanity's potential future among the stars. "We need to tell everyone," Philip said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Not just about what we saw here today, but about the choice we're being offered. The invitation we've been given." As they made their way back down the moor, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed, Philip felt a profound sense of change. The mystery that had begun with his solitary encounter had evolved into something far greater. Potential turning point for all of humanity. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or wonders awaited as they shared their discovery with the world, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The truth was out there, and now, finally, it was ready to be known. Chapter 18. Conference. In the days following their extraordinary experience on Ilkley Moor, Philip and his team worked tirelessly to prepare for what would undoubtedly be the most important presentation of their lives. The decision to organize a UFO conference in Ilkley was met with mixed reactions. Excitement from believers, skepticism from doubters, and barely concealed anxiety from local officials worried about the influx of attention. The small town of Ilkley was transformed. Hotels were booked solid, streets were crowded with curious onlookers and media vans, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Conference was to be held in the Ilkley Playhouse, the same venue where Philip had once debated Thomas Watterson. As the day of the conference dawned, Philip stood at the window of his study, looking out over the moor in the distance. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. What they were about to reveal would change the world forever. Margaret appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. "Are you ready for this, Phil?" He squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's go change the world." The Ilkley Playhouse was packed to capacity. Journalists, researchers, skeptics, and believers alike filled every seat. In the front row, Philip could see Peter Hoe and Jenny Randalls, their faces a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Detective Inspector Foster sat nearby, her expression unreadable. As Philip took the stage, accompanied by Samantha, Agent Thompson, and Maria, a hush fell over the crowd. He looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. What we're about to share with you today will challenge everything you think you know about our place in the universe." Over the next hour, they presented their evidence. Philip recounted his original encounter and the subsequent investigation. Samantha detailed the electromagnetic anomalies and the decoded message. Agent Thompson, in a surprising move, confirmed the government's long-standing interest in UFO phenomena. Maria provided context, linking the Ilkley incidents to a global pattern of sightings and encounters. But it was the video footage from their recent return to the moor that truly captivated the audience. As the images of the alien being and the craft played on the large screen, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Philip stepped forward again. "What you've just seen, it is not the end of our story, but the beginning. The beings we encountered didn't just reveal themselves, they gave us a message, an invitation." He went on to describe the vision he had experienced, the glimpses of other worlds and civilizations, the sense of humanity's potential place among the stars. As he spoke, he could see the impact of his words on the audience. Expressions of disbelief gave way to wonder, skepticism to cautious hope. When they opened the floor for questions, the response was overwhelming. Hands shot up across the auditorium, voices clamoring to be heard. A respected astrophysicist stood. "Mr. Spencer, the implications of what you're suggesting are staggering. How can we be sure that these beings have peaceful intention?" Before Philip could respond, Thomas Watterson's voice cut through the crowd. "This is preposterous. Mr. Spencer expects us to believe that aliens are inviting us to join some sort of galactic community? Where's the proof? Where's the scientific rigor?" Murmurs of agreement and disagreement rippled through the audience. Philip raised his hands for quiet. "Mr. Watterson, I understand your skepticism. I was once a skeptic myself, but the evidence we've presented today isn't just my testimony. It's corroborated by multiple witnesses, scientific data, and video footage. As for the intentions of these beings, we can only go by what they've shown us. The vision I experienced was one of cooperation, of shared knowledge and growth." Maria stepped forward. "If I may add, the pattern of encounters we've documented globally suggests a long-term effort at gradual disclosure. If their intentions were hostile, why take such a careful, prolonged approach?" The debate continued, with arguments and counter-arguments flying back and forth. Scientists questioned the data, theologians pondered the spiritual implications, and government representatives demanded to know why they had been kept in the dark. As the conference stretched into its third hour, commotion at the back of the hall caught everyone's attention. A group of people was pushing their way through the crowd, led by a distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. "My name is Dr. Jonathan Harper," the man announced as he reached the stage. "I represent a coalition of scientists and government officials from around the world. We've been monitoring your investigation, Mr. Spencer, and in light of what you've revealed today, we're prepared to go public with our own finding." A buzz of excitement swept through the room. Dr. Harper continued. "Our data confirms much of what you've presented. Moreover, we've detected similar electromagnetic anomalies at sites across the globe. We believe we're on the verge of establishing direct communication." The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. The implications were clear. This was no longer just about Ilkley Moor or even the UK. This was a global phenomenon, one that governments and scientists around the world were finally ready to acknowledge. As the conference drew to a close, Philip found himself at the center of a media frenzy. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the air buzzed with the energy of a world on the brink of monumental change. Looking out at the sea of faces, some excited, some frightened, all forever changed by what they had learned, Philip felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. They had done it. They had brought the truth to light. But he knew that this was just the beginning. As he left the stage, exhausted but exhilarated, Philip caught Margaret's eye in the crowd. Her smile, proud and reassuring, grounded him amidst the chaos. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead as humanity grappled with this new reality, they would face it together. The truth was out there, and now, finally, it was here for all to see. The next chapter in human history was about to begin. Philip Spencer, once a skeptic, now stood at the forefront of humanity's greatest adventure. Chapter 19, Breakthrough or Hoax. In the days following the Ilkley Conference, the world erupted into a frenzy of debate, speculation, and polarizing opinions. Philip Spencer and his team found themselves at the center of a global storm, their lives forever altered by the magnitude of their revelations. News outlets around the world ran non-stop coverage of the conference and its implications. Social media platforms were ablaze with discussions, memes, and heated argument. Religious leaders called emergency meetings to discuss the theological implications of extraterrestrial life. Stock markets fluctuated wildly as investors tried to predict the economic impact of potential alien technology. Amid the chaos, Philip and his team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout, push for further investigation and open disclosure. They gave interviews, met with government officials, and collaborated with Dr. Harper's International Coalition of Scientists. It was during this whirlwind of activity that a new development threatened to undermine everything they had worked for. Philip was in the middle of a video conference with researchers from NASA when Samantha burst into the room, her face pale with worry. "Phil, you need to see this," she said, thrusting her tablet towards him. On the screen was a video that was rapidly going viral. It showed a man claiming to be a special effects artist, demonstrating how he had allegedly created the footage of the alien being and craft from the moor. "It's all fake," the man in the video said, grinning at the camera. "Green screen, CGI, and some clever editing. I can't believe people fell for it." Philip felt his stomach drop. This can't be real," he muttered, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Within hours, the video had been picked up by major news networks. Skeptics rallied around this new evidence, claiming it as proof that the entire Ilkley Moor incident was an elaborate hoax. The team scrambled to respond. They released statements asserting the authenticity of their footage and pointing out the multiple witnesses and corroborating evidence. But the damage was done. Public opinion began to shift, with many who had been on the fence now leaning towards skepticism. As they gathered in Philip's living room to discuss their next move, the atmosphere was tense. "We need to debunk this debunker," Samantha said, pacing the room. "I can analyze the original footage, prove it hasn't been tampered with." Agent Thompson shook his head. "It might not be enough. Once doubt has been introduced, it's hard to dispel." Maria, who had been quietly tapping away at her laptop, suddenly looked up. "Wait a minute. Something about this doesn't add up. The man in the video, the supposed special effects artist, I can't find any record of him working in the industry." This sparked a new line of investigation. As they dug deeper, they uncovered inconsistencies in the debunker's story. The software he claimed to have used hadn't been released at the time the original footage was taken. Some of the techniques he demonstrated didn't match the actual content of their video. "It's a counter-operation," Agent Thompson said grimly. "Someone's trying to discredit us. The question is, who? And why now?" Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Inspector Foster called Philip, her voice tight with urgency. "Spencer, we've got something. One of my officers recognized the man in the debunking video. He's not a special effects artist. He's a small-time criminal with a history of fraud." This was the lead they needed. Working with Foster, they were able to track down the man behind the video. Under questioning, he broke down and admitted that he had been paid to create the debunking video by a group he knew only as the Gatekeeper. Armed with this information, Philip and his team went on the offensive. They held a press conference, presenting their evidence and exposing the fraudulent nature of the debunking video. This was a deliberate attempt to suppress the truth, Philip declared to the assembled reporters. We don't know who these gatekeepers are or what their motives might be, but we do know this. They're afraid of what we've discovered. They're afraid of the change that's coming. The revelation of the hoax within a hoax reignited public interest and lent new credibility to Philip and his team. The pendulum of public opinion began to swing back in their favor. As the dust settled, Philip found himself standing once again on Ilkley Moor, looking out over the misty landscape that had started it all. Margaret stood beside him, her hand in his. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. Philip was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'm thinking that this is bigger than us, Maggie. Bigger than Ilkley, bigger than any one country or government. Whatever's out there, whoever these beings are, they're going to change everything. And not everyone is ready for that change." Margaret squeezed his hand. "But we'll face it together, won't we? All of us?" Philip nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Together. And who knows, maybe this was all part of their plan. A test, to see how we'd handle the truth. As they turned to head back home, Philip felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with doubters and those who would try to suppress the truth. But he was more convinced than ever that what they had experienced was real, and that humanity stood on the brink of its greatest adventure. The truth was out there, and now, despite all efforts to the contrary, it was here to stay. Whatever came next, Philip Spencer was ready to face it head-on, armed with the support of his team, the love of his wife, and the unshakable certainty of what he had witnessed on the misty moors of Ilkley. Chapter 20. The Hidden Message. In the aftermath of the debunking controversy, Philip and his team found themselves more determined than ever to uncover the full truth behind the Ilkley Moor incident. With their credibility restored and public interest at an all-time high, they decided to revisit the strange electromagnetic signals that Samantha had detected months earlier. Samantha had been working tirelessly to decode the complex patterns hidden within the signals. Late one night, as the team gathered in Philip's study, she burst in with excitement gleaming in her eyes. "I've cracked it," she exclaimed, her laptop clutched tightly to her chest. "The signal. It's not just random noise. It's a message. But not like anything we've seen before." The team huddled around as Samantha set up her computer. On the screen, a series of intricate, shifting patterns appeared, part mathematical equation, part artistic mandala. "It's a multi-dimensional encoding," Samantha explained, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "It contains information in layers, visual, mathematical, and even what I believe to be emotional imprint." As they watched, the patterns began to resolve into recognizable images, star maps, DNA helices, and strange symbols that seemed to shift and change even as they looked at them. "What does it mean?" Margaret asked, her voice hushed with awe. Samantha's expression was a mixture of excitement and frustration. "That's the thing. I can only decode parts of it. It's like trying to read a book written in 100 different languages at once. But from what I can decipher, it seems to be a kind of invitation." "An invitation to what?" Agent Thompson asked, his usual skepticism tinged with wonder. "To join them," Philip said softly, a distant look in his eyes. "It's what I saw in my vision on the moor. They're inviting us to take our place in a larger cosmic community." Maria, who had been furiously taking notes, looked up. "But why? What do they want from us?" It was Dr. Edwin Blackwood, Jr., who had joined their team as a historical consultant, who answered. "Perhaps it's not about what they want from us, but what they believe we're ready for. Throughout human history, great leaps in civilization have often come from the exchange of ideas between cultures. Maybe this is just that on a cosmic scale." As the team debated the implications of the message, Philip found his mind drawn back to the vivid visions he had experienced during his encounters. Flashes of other worlds, the sense of vast knowledge just beyond his grasp, it all seemed to align with what Samantha had discovered. "There's more," Samantha said, her voice cutting through the discussion. "The message, it contains coordinates, specific locations around the world." A hush fell over the room as the implications sank in. These weren't just random signals. They were a roadmap, a series of waypoints leading to something. "We need to investigate these locations," Philip said, his voice filled with determination. "Whatever the full message is, whatever they're trying to show us, the answers are out there." The next few days were a flurry of activity as the team prepared for a global expedition. They reached out to Dr. Harper's International Coalition, coordinating efforts to explore the locations specified in the alien message. As news of their discoveries spread, the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Governments that had been hesitant to acknowledge the reality of extraterrestrial contact now scrambled to be part of the unfolding event. The first coordinate led them to a remote location in the Atacama Desert in Chile. As Philip stepped off the plane, accompanied by Samantha and Maria, he felt a sense of déjà vu, the same tingling at the base of his skull that he had experienced on Ilkley Moor. They were met by a team of local scientists and government officials. As they approached the designated coordinates, their equipment began to react, displaying readings similar to those they had encountered in Yorkshire. And then they saw it. A structure, half buried in the sand, its surface covered in the same intricate shifting patterns they had seen in Samantha's decoded message. "It's some kind of beacon," one of the scientists breathed, his voice filled with awe. As similar reports came in from other locations around the globe, the depths of the Amazon rainforest, an ice cave in Antarctica, underwater structure off the coast of Japan, it became clear that they were dealing with a network of alien artifacts, each containing a piece of a larger message. Back in Ilkley, Margaret coordinated the influx of data from the various expeditions. Agent Thompson worked tirelessly to manage the security and diplomatic challenges that arose from this truly global endeavor. As the pieces of the cosmic puzzle began to come together, a clearer picture emerged. The message was indeed an invitation, but it was also a challenge. The alien intelligence seemed to be testing humanity's ability to cooperate, put aside national and ideological differences in pursuit of a greater understanding. Late one night, as Philip sat in his study poring over the latest reports, he felt a sudden shift in the air. Looking up, he found himself face to face with the alien being he had encountered on the moor. This time, there was no fear, no confusion. Instead, Philip felt a profound sense of understanding wash over him. Without words, the being communicated a series of impressions, images of Earth joining a vast network of civilizations, of humanity taking its first steps into a larger, more wondrous universe. As the vision faded, Philip was left with a deep conviction. The hidden message, the artifacts scattered across the globe, they were more than just an invitation. They were a blueprint for humanity's future among the stars. With renewed purpose, Philip reached for his phone. It was time to bring the team together once more. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and with them, the dawn of a new era for humanity. As he looked out the window towards Ilkley Moor, shrouded as always in its mysterious mist, Philip Spencer knew that the greatest adventure in human history was only just beginning. Chapter 21. Government Secret. As the global investigation into the alien artifacts intensified, Philip and his team found themselves navigating increasingly complex political waters. The cooperation between nations that had initially flourished in the face of this cosmic revelation was beginning to strain under the weight of old rivalries and new fears. It was in this tense atmosphere that Agent Thompson received a cryptic message from one of his contacts deep within the British government. The message was brief but urgent. "Pandora's box is open. Meet at the usual place. I'm alone." Thompson shared the message with Philip, his face grave. "I have to go," he said. "This could be the break we've been waiting for." Philip nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Be careful," he cautioned. "We don't know who we can trust anymore." As Thompson left for his clandestine meeting, the rest of the team continued their work. Samantha and Dr. Blackwood were making progress in deciphering more of the alien message, while Maria coordinated with her international contacts to gather information on how different governments were responding to the unfolding events. Hours passed with no word from Thompson. Philip found himself pacing restlessly, unable to shake a growing sense of unease. Just as he was about to suggest they try to contact the agent, The door burst open. Thompson stumbled in, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, a wild look in his eyes. "We've been blind," he gasped, clutching a thick folder to his chest. All this time, they knew. They've always known. As the team gathered around, Thompson spread the contents of the folder across the table. What they saw left them speechless. Classified documents, some dating back to the 1940s, detailed a long history of extraterrestrial contact and government cover-ups. The Roswell incident, Rendlesham Forest encounter, and dozens of other cases that had been publicly dismissed were laid bare, revealing a truth far stranger than any of them had imagined. "My contact," Thompson explained, his voice hoarse. "He's part of a group within the government that's been pushing for disclosure for years. They've been collecting evidence, building a case. But now, with everything that's happening, they're afraid that those who want to keep this secret will take drastic action." As they pored over the documents, a chilling picture emerged. For decades, a secret cabal within various world governments had been aware of extraterrestrial presence on Earth. They had recovered alien technology, made covert agreements, and ruthlessly suppressed any information that threatened to expose the truth. "But why?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why keep this hidden for so long?" "Power," Maria said grimly, looking up from a particularly disturbing report. "Can you imagine the advantage of having access to advanced alien technology? The political leverage of being the gatekeepers to cosmic knowledge?" Philip felt a surge of anger. All this time, while we've been struggling to understand what's happening, they've been sitting on the truth. Millions of people questioning their sanity, their experiences dismissed and ridiculed. And for what? So a few could play at being gods? As the implications of these revelations sank in, the team realized that their mission had just become far more dangerous and far more important. They weren't just uncovering the truth about alien contact. They were threatening to expose decades of government conspiracy and cover-ups. "We need to go public with this," Samantha said, her eyes blazing with determination. "All of it. The world deserves to know the truth." But even as she spoke, they all understood the risks. The forces that had kept this secret for so long wouldn't give up without a fight. As if to underscore this point, Thompson's phone buzzed with a text from his contact. "They know. Get out now. Trust no one." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from shock to urgency. They had to act fast, but they also had to be smart. Simply dumping all this information online could cause global panic and give their opponents the opportunity to discredit or suppress it. "We need a plan," Philip said, his mind racing. "A way to release this information strategically, to protect ourselves and ensure it reaches the right people." As they began to formulate their strategy, Philip couldn't help but wonder if this too was part of the alien intelligence's test. Were they watching now? Seeing how humanity would handle not just the revelation of their existence, but the exposure of its own deepest, darkest secret? Looking around at his team, Thompson with his insider knowledge, Samantha with her technical expertise, Maria with her journalistic connections, and Margaret with her unwavering support, Philip felt a glimmer of hope. They had uncovered the truth this far. Now they would make sure the world knew it too, no matter the cost. As night fell over Ilkley, the team worked tirelessly, preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most significant and dangerous phase of their journey yet. The truth about aliens was out there, yes, but so were the secrets of those who had hidden it for so long. And bringing both to light would change the world forever. Chapter 22. The Bigger Picture. The days following the revelation of the government's long-standing cover-up were a blur of frenetic activity. Philip and his team. They worked around the clock, carefully curating the classified information and preparing for its strategic release. Their makeshift headquarters had been moved to a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of Ilkley, borrowed from one of Dr. Blackwood's trusted friends. Security was tight, with Agent Thompson's loyal contacts providing discreet protection. As they sifted through decades of suppressed information, a staggering picture began to emerge. One that connected their experiences on Ilkley Moor to a vast, cosmic tapestry. "Look at this," Samantha said one morning, her eyes wide as she pored over a series of documents. There are reports of similar electromagnetic anomalies dating back to the 1950s all around the world. Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, the Great Pyramid, they're all mentioned as focal points. Dr. Blackwood nodded excitedly. It aligns perfectly with my grandfather's theories. He always believed these ancient sites were more than just human constructions, that they were somehow connected to something greater. Maria, who had been coordinating with a network of trusted journalists around the globe, looked up from her laptop. And it's not just Earth. There are classified NASA reports here suggesting similar structures have been observed on Mars and some of Jupiter's moons. Philip felt a chill run down his spine as the implications sank in. So what we encountered on Ilkley Moor, it's part of something that's been ongoing for millennia. Maybe even since the dawn of human civilization. Or before, Thompson added grimly. Some of these reports speculate that Earth itself might have been terraformed, for lack of a better word, prepared for human development by an advanced alien intelligence. The room fell silent as they grappled with the enormity of what they were uncovering. It wasn't just about UFO sightings or government cover-ups anymore. They were piecing together a story that rewrote the very history of humanity and its place in the universe. As they continued their work, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The alien artifacts discovered around the world weren't just communication devices. They were part of a vast, planet-wide network designed to monitor and guide human progress. It's like we've been part of some grand cosmic experiment, Margaret mused, her voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. Philip nodded, his mind racing. Or a nursery. Protected space for our species to grow and develop until we were ready for, what? First contact? Joining a galactic community? The question hung in the air, unanswered but filled with possibility. As they prepared to release their findings to the world, the team was acutely aware of the impact this information would have. It wasn't just governments they were up against now. They were challenging the very foundations of human history and belief. We need to be careful how we present this, Maria cautioned. If we dump all of this information at once, it could cause panic, societal breakdown. Samantha agreed. We need to release it in stages. Start with the government cover-ups, then gradually introduce the bigger picture. Give people time to adjust each new revelation. As they finalized their plan, Philip found himself drawn to the window, looking out towards Ilkley Moor in the distance. Place where it had all begun for him now seemed both intimately familiar and utterly alien. What are you thinking? Margaret asked, joining him at the window. Philip was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I'm thinking about how small we are, he said finally. How young. All our history, our achievements, our conflicts, they're just the first steps of a species taking its place in something far greater than we ever imagined. Margaret squeezed his hand. And yet, here we are. A retired policeman, tech expert, a journalist, a historian, just ordinary people, but we're the ones who get to share this truth with the world. Philip nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Whatever happens next, whatever we face, not just about us anymore. It's about the future of our entire species. As the sun set over Ilkley Moor, bathing the ancient landscape in a golden light, Philip Spencer and his team prepared to change the world ever. They had uncovered the truth about aliens, about human history, about humanity's place in the cosmos. Now, they had to share it with a world that might not be ready to hear it. The bigger picture was finally coming into focus, and it was more wondrous and terrifying than any of them had ever imagined. As they stood on the precipice of this new era, Philip knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not just as a team, but as representatives of a human race about to take its first tentative steps into a vast and awe-inspiring universe. Chapter 23, Legacy of an Encounter. 5 years had passed since Philip Spencer and his team had released their earth-shattering revelations to the world. The initial chaos and disbelief had gradually given way to a new reality, one in which humanity grappled daily with its place in a vast and complex universe. Philip stood at the edge of Ilkley Moor, place where his extraordinary journey had begun. The landscape looked much the same, misty, ancient, mysterious, but Philip knew that everything had changed. Penny for your thoughts? Margaret's voice came from behind him. She joined him, slipping her hand into his as they looked out over the moor. Philip smiled, squeezing her hand. Just thinking about how far we've come. How much has changed. And indeed, the world had transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. The gradual release of information about extraterrestrial contact and the true history of human development reshaped every aspect of society. Governments around the world had been forced to acknowledge their decades-long deception, leading to a crisis of trust that was still being navigated. But from this upheaval, a new form of global cooperation had emerged. The United Nations had been restructured into the Earth Unity Council, tasked with representing humanity in its nascent interstellar relations. Scientific progress had accelerated at an unprecedented rate, as researchers gained access to previously suppressed alien technology. Breakthroughs in clean energy, medicine, and space travel were transforming life on Earth and opening up new frontiers among the stars. Religion and philosophy had undergone profound shifts as humanity grappled with its place in a universe teeming with intelligent life. New schools of thought had emerged, seeking to reconcile ancient wisdom with cosmic realities. As Philip and Margaret made their way back to the town, they passed the newly constructed Ilkley Moor Visitor Centre. Once a quiet hiking destination, Ilkley had become a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand humanity's cosmic heritage. Inside, they found Samantha giving a lecture to a group of wide-eyed students. Her expertise in decoding alien communications had made her one of the world's foremost experts in the burgeoning field of xenolinguistics. The key to understanding our cosmic neighbors, Samantha was saying, is recognizing that communication goes beyond language. It's about sharing experiences, emotions, entire ways of perceiving reality. As the lecture ended, Samantha joined Philip and Margaret. "Can you believe it's been 5 years?" she said, her eyes bright with the same enthusiasm that had driven their initial investigation. They made their way to a small cafe where Maria and Dr. Blackwood were waiting. Maria, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for her role in breaking the story of the century, was busy typing on her tablet. "Just finished an interview with the Aldebaran delegation," she said, looking up as they sat down. "They're fascinated by our music. Apparently harmony is a rare concept in the galaxy." Dr. Blackwood chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "My grandfather would have loved to see this. Aliens discussing Mozart over tea in Ilkley." As they caught up, Philip couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. Fear, the doubt, the struggles, it had all led to this new world of wonder and possibility. Agent Thompson joined them later, looking more relaxed than Philip had ever seen him. After the initial revelations, Thompson had played a crucial role in dismantling the old structures of secrecy and establishing new protocols for cosmic diplomacy. "We're making progress," Thompson reported. "The Earth Unity Council has approved the first human delegation to the Galactic Cooperative. We're officially taking our place among the stars." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Ilkley Moor, the team made their way to a spot that had become special to them, the exact location where Philip had first encountered the alien being. Standing there, surrounded by friends who had become family, Philip felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with fear and confusion had led to understanding, growth, and a new destiny for all of humanity. "You know," Philip said, addressing his friends, "when I first saw that being on the moor, I thought my life had been turned upside down. I never imagined it would lead to this. Changing the entire world." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Not just the world, love. The entire human race." As they stood there, a familiar tingling sensation ran down Philip's spine. Air seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, he thought he saw the outline of an alien figure in the mist. Not fearsome now, welcoming. The vision passed quickly, but its message was clear. This was not an end, but a beginning. Humanity's journey among the stars was just getting started, and the legacy of that first encounter on Ilkley Moor would echo through the cosmos for generations to come. As night fell and stars began to twinkle in the sky, stars that now held new meaning and possibility, Philip Spencer looked at his friends, at the moor where it had all begun, and at the vast universe that awaited. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever wonders were yet to be discovered, He knew that humanity was ready to face them. The truth was out there. And now, finally, was here. A legacy of an encounter that had changed everything, opening the door to humanity's greatest adventure. Chapter 24. Unresolved Mystery. As the sun rose over Ilkley Moor, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Philip Spencer stood at the window of his study, a cup of steaming tea in his hand. 15 years had passed since that fateful morning when he first encountered the unknown on the misty moor, and yet the wonder of it all had never faded. The world had changed dramatically in those years. Humanity had taken its first tentative steps into the galactic community, establishing diplomatic relations with a handful of alien civilizations. Earth itself had been transformed, with new technologies reshaping every aspect of life, from energy production to medicine to transportation. And yet, for all the progress and revelations, mysteries remained. Philip turned from the window as Margaret entered the room, her silver hair catching the early morning light. "The grandchildren will be here soon," she reminded him with a smile. "Are you ready for story time?" Philip chuckled. "As ready as I'll ever be. Though I'm not sure they'll ever tire of hearing about the old days." As they prepared for the arrival of their family, Philip's mind wandered back over the years. The initial chaos following their revelations had given way to a new world order, one built on the understanding that humanity was part of a larger cosmic tapestry. But it hadn't been an easy journey. There had been resistance, of course. Religious fundamentalists who refused to accept the new reality, conspiracy theorists who insisted that it was all an elaborate hoax, politicians who tried to use the situation to grasp for power. Gradually, inexorably, the truth had prevailed. The doorbell rang, interrupting Philip's reverie. Soon the house was filled with the joyful noise of his children and grandchildren. As they gathered in the living room, the youngest 7-year-old Lily tugged at Philip's sleeve. "Grandpa," she said, her eyes wide with excitement, "tell us about the aliens again." Philip settled into his favorite armchair. Family gathered around him. "Well," he began, his voice taking on the tone of a seasoned storyteller, "it all started on a misty morning, right here on Ilkley Moor." As he recounted the tale, Philip was struck by how much it still felt like yesterday. Fear and confusion of that first encounter. The thrill of discovery as they unraveled the mystery. The weight of responsibility as they prepared to share the truth with the world. When he finished, Lily looked up at him with a furrowed brow. "But Grandpa," she said, "we know aliens are real now. Why haven't they come to visit us here?" Philip exchanged a glance with Margaret. It was a question that had been asked countless times over the years by scientists, politicians, and ordinary people alike. Despite the established diplomatic channels and the exchange of knowledge, direct contact between humans and aliens on Earth remained rare and carefully controlled. "Well, Louis," Philip said carefully, "the universe is a very big place, with lots of different beings who all have their own ways of doing things. Our alien friends are giving us time to get used to the idea of them, grow and learn at our own pace." As the children debated what they would say to an alien if they met one, Philip found himself once again marveling at the journey that had brought them to this point. They had uncovered so much, changed so much, and yet the sense of wonder and mystery remained. Later that evening, after the family had gone and the house was quiet once more, Philip and Margaret took a walk on the moor. The mist rolled in, familiar and yet still somehow mysterious, as it had been on that morning 15 years ago. "Do you ever wonder," Margaret said softly, "if we'll ever know the whole truth about why they chose to reveal themselves when they did, what their ultimate intentions are?" Philip was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think," he said finally, "that maybe that's not the point. Maybe the mystery itself, the continuous journey of discovery, is what's important. Keeps us curious, keeps us reaching for the stars." As they stood there, hand in hand, Philip felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the mist, a hint of something not quite human. But then it was gone, leaving behind only questions and possibilities. And Philip Spencer, once a skeptic, now a key figure in humanity's greatest adventure, smiled. The universe, it seemed, would always have secrets to share, mysteries to unravel, And humanity, with its insatiable curiosity and boundless imagination, would always be ready to explore them. As they turned to head home, Philip took one last look at the misty moor where it had all begun. Truth was out there, yes. So was wonder, and discovery, and the endless possibility of the unknown. And in that unresolved mystery lay the greatest adventure of all. The end.